And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have with us tonight already. Of course, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, storm warning, storm coming in.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty good metaphor, actually, for the show that we're doing.
It is indeed.
Interestingly enough. And because there are literal storms and metaphorical ones, and I'll tell you, we're coming to the middle of both of them here. And we're going to get into the storms tonight through the figure of G.I. Gurdjieff and his system of the fourth way. And of course, that includes the work of Ouspensky and J.G. Bennett and what these mystery schools were bringing forward at this particular time, moving through about 1915 to 1950. That period, which is a little different than the early build-up period of theosophy into anthroposophy. And as we go through this period of time where we're looking at all the chaos in Afghanistan, we're going to find that much of the Gurdjieff early story takes place in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there are a lot of links there with the Masters of Wisdom, the Khwajagan. And the Khwajagan. We're going to get into them tonight. And the Ellery Caves in India that kind of form a backdrop for this scenario. But when we see that level of chaos internationally and politically, we know that something very great is moving. And it could literally be one of the greatest foreign policy disasters in American history unfolding. And it seemed like all of those politicians and the administration and the false Biden administration were just sitting there saying, like, we didn't know this was going to happen, which would seem unlikely that you have almost $1 trillion worth of weaponry that you set up in that country going into the hands of your enemy who staged supposedly the September 11th attacks. So something very wrong with that picture. Tonight's show is not on the politics of it, but the Afghanistan tie-in forms that backdrop. And of course, all of our prayers are with the people in Afghanistan trying to get out from this, draconian Taliban rule that they knew was going to roll in. And we here in America trying to push out from the draconian rules. They're trying to level up. We're also going to see how some of the international stage crisis forms a picture and a tie into the Gurdjieff work as well through the case of the Uyghurs, who are the minority there in China that's being persecuted, genocided, stalked, DNA, ID, surveilled, put in prison camps. What was the Uyghurs' crime exactly? We're going to get into that tonight as well, because it's going to really shock you with its tie-in to this Masters of Wisdom tradition and what's happening there. But the CCP is trying to bring that system and make us all Uyghurs. So just remember that as we go in tonight. We're the ones they want to be Uyghurs here, which means the more we call that out and stop them on the international stage in relation to this, the more we call it the entire issue, because the group behind the Chinese communists is the same group meeting at Davos, and they are just planning for that world takeover, as we've seen and as we've reported on. But how can the Masters of Wisdom and the work of the Sarmon Brotherhood through the figure of G.I. Gurdjieff help us to understand the terror of the situation that we're in and get through it to the other side when these guys blow themselves up? Very interesting question.
Now, you're using that phrase, the terror of the situation.
Yeah, it comes directly out of Beelzebub's Tales, which is Gurdjieff's kind of masterwork. So if we back up a little bit, Gurdjieff came into Russia. He was a Greek Armenian, and he had traveled all around the world, but particularly there in Central Asia in search of these ancient brotherhoods, hooked up with them and worked with them for about a decade, and then came out and taught his own system. In Russia, there was a very difficult period of time there with the Russian Revolution, and that's when he was there opening this up, just prior to it. And the person that he came in contact with was P.D. Ouspensky, who was a Russian philosopher and mathematician. And Ouspensky really goes deep because even before the Gurdjieff work or anything, he had written Tertium Organum and a new model of the universe. And these are some of the clear sort of esoteric tomes of the period. There's nothing like them, and it shows his great insight. There's a famous meeting with Gurdjieff and Ouspensky where he says, I would bow down to you if you understood everything that you wrote in your own book. So there's kind of a one-upsmanship going on, but eventually it's very clear that Ouspensky wants to be the student of Gurdjieff in any case. And it's about 1912. He has just gone around the world for a newspaper, but particularly into India and looking for these groups. And he's writing all these very interesting stories. This is Ouspensky now. And the series of lectures is called In Search of the Miraculous, which will be what he's famous for later, the title, because they'll ascribe that to all of his Gurdjieff book. But the Gurdjieff book, in fact, that he wrote was called Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, which I can say actually fits the picture much better because it's intense, the parts and the puzzle pieces that Gurdjieff puts together and that Ouspensky opens up in that book, which he waited some 20 years to publish until his death, in fact. And I think all that just to show that he was certainly not doing this for any, he wasn't doing it to be popular. He really wanted to learn it, and he wanted to make sure it got out before he, once he passed away. So we're in X series 106 here. We're going to be going deep. This is the Gurdjieff Mystery School warning. And we have elements in there of the world in crisis, societal collapse, but transformation in the heart of it. And that's what we'll be going into tonight. In the second half of the program, we're going to be taking your questions. And Miss Olivia will be taking those. How is it looking out there? How's the temperature?
Well, it's okay. I think everybody seems deeply concerned. There's a kind of a sober tone.
No question.
Which is, the calm surface underneath which is a lot of angst and a lot of impatience, for the tides to turn and, wondering where this is all headed. It doesn't look good.
Well,
so a little hope tonight would go a long way.
Absolutely. Well, there are always many possibilities. Of course, the biggest key in any kind of societal collapse or the type of situations that we've been watching, the real draconian measures with the whole, lockdown thing, them talking about that and them talking about going into, even with all of these studies coming out saying, hey, this stuff we've been giving you isn't effective. It's nice that hundreds of millions of you lined up for it, but it's not working. There's going to be a reckoning in all this. I don't think there's any question about it. And I think what we need to do here on the public side, in America, in Spain, in Canada, around the world, in Australia, where the draconian lockdowns are off the charts, and thank you, those of you who are in Australia and writing to me, the incredible people in New Zealand going through the things they had. They had one COVID case there, and they locked the whole place down.
Unbelievable.
I mean, that's a test of power that even Hitler would have been afraid to pull off. That's sort of marching on the Rhine, times 10, because you're just telling everybody you don't get to do it. And they had one of their health ministers come out, and she was saying, well, don't order anything online because you don't want to go near the door. Well, that's good.
Did they say that?
Yeah.
Wow.
And what's interesting about that is what you're supposed to do, like wait for a pet treat at the screen of the window.
I guess you're supposed to wait for them to drop it off and go away and maybe leave it there for a little while in case there are any germs in the air.
Good. Not only shut down the regular economy, but shut down the online economy. That's smart.
Incredible.
Whatever they're pulling in New Zealand and Australia has to be watched closely as they try to export it. But also, if we can help the people there to break free of that situation by exposing it, we'll be doing the whole world a favor. And we'll get into that too. But for the people over in that part of the world, hang in there, and we'll definitely get through. Now, so we've started off with Ouspensky. Let's take a look at Ouspensky here. He had this incredible sort of searching demeanor about him and something very powerful in his work. I can tell you that his books have been some of the greatest influence of my life, including his nonfiction as well. And interestingly enough, his nonfiction is not that well known. But for me, you can find 3 incredible books that are nonfiction of Ouspensky's. One is The Strange Life of Ivan Ossikan, which is basically a version of, kind of the Groundhog Day theme, where Ossikan keeps going back into this life and replaying it over and over again, trying to get it right. And a number of odd things show up there. In later versions, a character named the Magician shows up, and that is Gurdjieff. So it's kind of a real-time book when he picks it up. But what's less obscure, what's more obscure, less well known, is 2 books that fall under the heading Talks with the Devil. Now, you're going to notice that Talks with the Devil and Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is Gurdjieff's book, both of them are using this devil metaphor to get information and truths out. So they're kind of confronting the devil, and the devil is giving up his secrets. This goes very much with the Steiner theme dealing with Ahriman, which is that humanity needs to face Ahriman awares and get those answers and move on. So it's kind of a showdown in both of those books, both using this very heavy motif of the devil. Now, I want to read something right off the bat from that book before we get into the deeper jump with Ouspensky on this, because there's a whole section in here on Adam and Eve that I've always found fascinating, and it'll just give us a setup on the kind of thinker that Ouspensky was. Again, this is Talks with the Devil. It's the second book about this journalist named Leslie who encounters the devil in India, and the name of the book is The Benevolent Devil. So they start talking about Adam and Eve, and the journalist is questioning the devil, kind of like an interview with the vampire type situation. And so the devil says, the legend about paradise, however, persisted among the descendants of Adam and Eve for a long time, and it was reputed that their ancestors were exiled from paradise because of some crime. This is actually our version of the story. We made several more changes at the same time. For instance, we let people think that it is we who are the descendants of the Great One, and that the Great One rebelled against God. We twisted the facts so thoroughly that only a few people are capable of unraveling the truth. That is why, as I told you at the beginning of our talk, it is difficult for me to explain the real position to you. You see, you are in error quite as such on our account as on your own. The descendants of Adam interbred with the descendants of animals to such a degree that it became quite difficult to distinguish them. As a result, there came about many curious situations and misunderstandings. At times, even we could not tell the difference between them. For instance, many of us who would buy souls of the descendants of Adam only to find that they had no souls. This happened because the descendants of the animals pretended to be the descendants of Adam, and even we fell for it. Keep that in mind as we go forward here about Ouspensky opening up these alternative versions of historical accounts. But there are all kinds of unusual exchanges like that with Leslie and the devil that just take us into these deeper levels of the origins of humanity. And it's very interesting because when we get into Ouspensky, this is where his mind goes very often, which is how did the actual situation happen? Now, there's a few weird things about Ouspensky on the metaphysical side right off the bat. One is that when Casey had recommended, Edgar Casey had recommended his book, Tertium Organum. And Tertium Organum was a real breakthrough book. It's from 1908. And there really wasn't anything quite like it. It was a mix of physics and mysticism. And so we have Edgar Casey recommending it for somebody to round themselves out spiritually, which shows the regard that he had for Ouspensky. But then later in that recommendation, he starts going off in his trance, talking about Ouspensky, and he says, oh yes, he was the one who was the record keeper, the keeper of the records in the Mount for the Mahaba people. And then he said, 7 month, 7 year, 7th hour, 777. So there's something instantly that Casey was viewing in the Akashic record in relation to Ouspensky. So Ouspensky had this incredible past life experience of being this keeper of these records in the Mount, and it showed up there. Later, which I found very interesting, in 1943, you can actually find a reading of Casey's where at the end of it he says, "This is Ouspensky giving this," meaning, and Ouspensky is alive because he dies in 1947. So, in fact, Casey is channeling him while he's alive. So keep that in mind as we go forward. When we're dealing with Ouspensky and his work, we're dealing with somebody who shows up very heavily on that mystery school radar. He's not just somebody who is kind of has good insights. But what's interesting is he was a journalist there for many years with a Russian newspaper. So when the Russian Revolution happens, it is massive chaos. And he can't believe how quickly these people in the intelligentsia there are just changing sides and instantly becoming socialists overnight. It's also quite interesting that the complete breakdown just confirms everything that he felt about human nature growing up. Now, I should mention here that Ouspensky had a sister who was a political prisoner, and he used to visit her in prison, giving him some of that kind of depressive overlay, I would say, to some of his work. You know, Ouspensky just has that kind of aura.
What was she in prison for?
It was really as part of a whole political protest thing, and they thought that she was an agitator. And so this was, you know, the great heartbreak of Ouspensky's life. And also that he grew up without a dad gave him kind of an interesting complex. By the time he runs across Gurdjieff, he's in search of masters. And people have also said, well, Gurdjieff was the ultimate dad for him. So there's a lot of issues that go on there where he wants to get the training from him. And then after a certain point, he starts to question Gurdjieff. And he says, I'm separating the teaching of Gurdjieff from Gurdjieff, in fact. So this gets us into a lot of dynamics. But the work itself is so incredibly rich that I think that those dynamics actually, the fact that they got through them years and years, because if you really look at the period that Ouspensky worked with Gurdjieff, it's 1915 to 1924 with some breaks in between. But then that's it. He won't work with him at all ever again. And it's a pretty heavy-duty cutoff. And the reasons have never been well understood or stated. But there was someone who was an associate of Ouspensky's who asked him, Boris Muryayev, and he comes to him and he says, you know, what was this all about? And he said, well, if you knew someone who was like a relative and very close to you and they turned out to be a criminal, what would you say? Now, Ouspensky had like an incredible high-mindedness about him. So a lot of people have surmised that he found out that Gurdjieff was spying for the Russian government, which we see that Gurdjieff was involved in a number of these kinds of intrigues. In fact, one of his biggest students, J.G. Bennett, finds him because he's spying on him because Gurdjieff had dealings with the Turkish royalty and all this stuff. So Gurdjieff is really sort of, you know, he's quite a number of different people in a sense. And he may have done these things in order to get right to the center of the teaching that he was seeking out, which became the fourth way teaching. And we're going to take from Gurdjieff himself exactly what he was looking for and what he found and the legacy that he's left for us all to draw on. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 106. Now we're going deep into the mystery school warning of Gurdjieff and the fourth way, P.D. Ouspensky, J.G. Bennett, the Enneagram. It's all there. And when you think about the incredible sort of echo of this powerful work, just like the echo of anthroposophy and of theosophy, you do look around in this period that we're in and you see those strands coming together and those pieces formulating. And this is the period, in fact, that they said, you know, in the case of anthroposophy, that this work was going to rise. And it was about 100 years after 1920, and that's just the period that we're in. I do feel like, you know, we've had an awful lot of pretenders to the throne when it comes to the field of esoteric information. And there There's also, a lot of gadflies, and that all goes in part of the search. There was in that era as well, but with the hyper commercialism, unfortunately, the kind of Gaia TV type stuff, we've gotten a lot of junk. So I think that the kind of standard that we can have for work like this is when we look through movements like the Fourth Way and like anthroposophy to bring us to a higher level, and to see the incredible work of people today who are doing powerful things. The work of Gigi Young, for example, the work in ancient history of Graham Hancock. These are things that can bring the whole level of our study up dramatically. And I'm very glad that we have the people that we do out there working on this. Okay. One of the things that the Fourth Way School warned through Gurdjieff and his students, particularly Bennett was good at this, and Bennett outsurvived Ouspensky and Gurdjieff by about 30 years. So he's much more, he goes through the 60s and 70s. He's much more into the things that happen there, the meditation and the Eastern bit, the Maharishi, and all these different things that come through. He's much more present for that and can respond to it, where people can only wonder, what would Gurdjieff have said about this? What would Ouspensky have said about this? So let's take a look at Gurdjieff's description of what the Fourth Way is. This is his system of ideas. And the idea fundamentally is that the traditional three ways of transformation for a human being would be the way of the monk, the priest, which is basically the way of devotion, the way of the fakir, which is conquering any physical ailments. This is the lying down in a bed of nails thing. You completely overwhelm that. And the way of the yogi, which is complete mastery of your mind and mind over matter. So the Fourth Way has the same possibilities as those ways for transforming an individual, but it can only be done in the circumstances that he finds himself or she finds herself in. Now, it can't be done away on a monastery, on a retreat or anything. It has to be done right in the day-to-day environment that you're in. And the thing about the Fourth Way that I think makes it almost like a mystery school experiments, and we know they've done many over the years, which is they knew the population was growing, they knew industrialization would take us to this place, and they knew it was not going to be possible for millions of people to have this type of monastic experience or to get training of a yogi. So what do? How do they transform? How do you move the culture? You release a technique into the general population for those who can see that it's there, which gives them the ability to achieve the same heights of realization as you would on these very dedicated spiritual paths. So it certainly is a spiritual path of sorts, but it is more of a collection of methods that have a kind of guiding philosophy behind it. So this is directly from Gurdjieff now speaking to his group, and this is Ouspensky in those early days. Remember, he charts from 1915 to 1921 in the Gurdjieff lectures and all these different workshops and things that they do all over Russia, and they go over to Finland. They literally have groups that study, and they'll do 2-month intensives, and they'll work around particular ideas. So this is Gurdjieff now. In the ordinary conditions of cultured life, the position of a man, of even an intelligent man who is seeking for knowledge, is hopeless. Because in the circumstances surrounding him, there is nothing resembling either fakir or yogic schools, while the religions of the West have degenerated to such an extent that for a long time there's been nothing alive in them. Various occult and mystical societies and naive experiments in the nature of spiritualism and so on can give no results. And the position would indeed be hopeless if the possibility of yet a fourth way did not exist. The fourth way requires no retirement in the desert, does not require a man to give up and renounce everything by which he formerly lived. The fourth way begins much further on than the way of the yogi. This is interesting. This means that a man must be prepared for the fourth way, and this preparation must be acquired in ordinary life and be a very serious one. Embracing many different sides. Furthermore, a man must be living in conditions favorable for work on the fourth way, or in any case, in conditions which do not render it impossible. It must be understood that both in the inner and in the external life of a man, there may be conditions which create insuperable barriers to the fourth way. Furthermore, the fourth way has no definite forms like the way of the fakir, the monk, and the yogi. And first of all, it has to be found. This is the first test. It is not well known as well known as the three traditional ways. There are many people who've never heard of the fourth way, and there are others who deny its existence or possibilities. So it's something which he discovered in his search, and it's something which was active, but it was something I believe that the mystery schools sent out for that large-scale awakening that needed to happen, and that they were in the middle of this mass of industrialization and seeing, again, just like they had the mystery school realization about 1840, as we see in those circles, the German circles at the time, the scientific materialism had taken over dramatically. So the mystery schools had a choice, and the choice was, we have to let some of those secrets out now, and if we don't, then in 100 years we won't recognize humanity. Well, the Gurdjieff work is kind of the second wave of that. It's almost like they had perfected something with theosophy, but theosophy had gone wrong, and everybody was pointing at everybody else saying, my master, is better than yours. And my ascended master, had Blavatsky's blessing and yours doesn't, And by the way, I met an ascended master and he gave me a whole new version of theosophy. So forget about the old one. Here I am, Theosophy 2.0. So, there were a lot of things like that. And in the words of Steiner, actually, theosophy became a playground for occult forces. It had collapsed from its incredible breakthrough in 1875. So we can see then this other wave, this other experiment, which was, we're going to emphasize in the Gurdjieff work, we're going to emphasize not the psychic experience right off the bat. That's going to be a secondary part of this. We're going to emphasize the willingness and ability to work. And we're going to call it the work. So this kind of puts us in a little bit of a different mentality about it. So it's sort of a second line of experimentation by the mystery schools. Yes, what do you got over there?
Trevor Smith actually has the question I had, which is,
Yeah.
What are those insuperable barriers that he's talking about?
Well, he's just saying that even though you can do it in your everyday life, there are situations that a person can find themselves in that, just make it impossible for them to be themselves. So, he's saying it's something that has to be sought, and you need to work with a group of people to do it. The fourth way isn't something that you can do on your own, and this is very interesting. I sometimes have people who write to me and they'll say, in earnest, I'm looking for a mystery school. Which one should I choose? And this is really hard because you sort of, a lot of the things that are out there that call themselves mystery schools just don't have anything to do with mystery schools. So, it's fine. And if people do them, then what they are really, they are in the nature of study. And what study does is it gives you more of a power around your magnetic center for certain ideas. So if I study Buddhism with a public group, as opposed to just reading about it with a book at home, I am opening up the field of energy with it. I'm exchanging ideas. If I'm doing it online, if we're talking to the ideas room about it, something happens there in the interchange that's beyond just me studying on my own. So that is a level of engagement. But there are things out there who are like, join my Ascension Mystery School or some nonsense like that you'll see online. And you see a lot of people peddling that kind of stuff. it just doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about. It's a kind of an imitation of the thing. Nonetheless, people find all sorts of different things for inspiration along the way. I'm just talking about the way that we're discussing the schools. So, like, for example, theosophy, anthroposophy, the Casey work, the Gurdjieff work, these are traditions that come out of the mystery schools directly. There's just no question about it. And there are others as well. So, I guess the best way sometimes that I answer that when people say it is, you can't start a mystery school. The schools are there and they can create one. You can certainly do your own mystery study, but there are levels of groups. So I think that's an important thing to think about. The ultimate kind of mystery schools, I think you have to really go deep, like Gurdjieff did, to go find them. And I think that they were, in a sense, more accessible in those days, because I think that their level of secrecy has to be so incredibly wide nowadays. And, when they have carried these traditions over for thousands and thousands of years, when you're talking about that level of mystery schools, it's pretty high. Now, there are all kinds of what they call lesser schools who don't possess as much information. And they would still blow anybody's mind. And there are also arcane schools, which just preserve the teaching exactly as they know it. They don't try to add to it. So it's almost like a library resource to go and deal with that. And then there's private study groups and public study groups. And, they're all kind of worthwhile and useful. It just depends on your level of commitment or what you're trying to do. I remember being in my 20s and looking for a Gurdjieff school and spending a lot of time researching and joining the various groups that dealt with Gurdjieff ideas, people who did movements. And it was all very interesting. I found, for some reason, this is just my own personal experience, that the people who were coming out of the Bennett tradition, remember Bennett had worked directly with Gurdjieff, but Bennett was fascinated with the movements part and how it helped us to stay engaged, and that the mental part didn't just run away. Some of the Ouspensky groups maybe were too mental. And I enjoy that stuff too. I'm just saying, I seem to remember having the best experience with the Bennett groups, and thinking that they really, had experienced something with him taking this tradition through Sherborne and the later things that he did all the way right until 1975. So I think that wave, it still extends out there. And this is an interesting thing that, Bennett had discussed with Gurdjieff about the mystery schools and things like the Fourth Way schools, that they're not necessarily meant to be institutionalized, that they are to be discovered, and they have a time. It's almost like Arthurian in a sense. It's a fair time. And they come out and they spread these seeds, and then they withdraw back into the mists, and then they come out, and they see what people have done with the seeds that they've put out there. This is the kind of, mentality that I think we need to get into to understand it. Now, let's grab just a few more references about the brotherhoods that trained Gurdjieff to come out and do this, because we're going to find that the brotherhood that he says really was the deep brotherhood that he worked with was the Tsar Moon Brotherhood. Tsar Moon is interesting for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it means bee, and they are the keepers of the honey of that deep ancient knowledge. When we get into X-steganography on this program, who kept that tradition of steganography down through the centuries, all the way back from the Egyptian Book of the Dead? These were the groups. So when we look at this, we have to see that long trajectory, and the aim of that trajectory is to preserve this deep knowledge for the sake of humanity. Just like the people who built the pyramids, they were putting something there in mathematics, in geometry, that they knew when culture comes back again, they might not even know what our hieroglyphs mean, but they will know the language of physics or geometry, and we'll leave that embedded here. and that's how we'll communicate with them. So steganography is very much the same thing, and we see so much of that in this case. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 106. We're going deep now into the mystery schools through the figure of G.I. Gurdjieff and his fourth way system. Gurdjieff now has told us the fourth way is something you can only do in the circumstances of everyday life. But now, what would you do? Well, there's a number of things that they did for self-awareness. One of them is called self-remembering, which is a technique very much like a waking meditation. One time when Ouspensky drew it out, he drew an arrow looking directly at the individual and looking out toward the world. So it was an extra level of awareness. I think what happens later is people assume a lot of the fourth way stuff is almost like boot camp, because there's a lot of stories of Gurdjieff putting people to work. Well, he would have these incredible people coming to him, and they would be saying, I'm so-and-so intellectual. I want to learn your system. What can we do to engage ideas and all this? And he would say, let's go dig in the backyard. And he'd have them dig a garden, and this kind of thing. So there was a lot of let's get it right in terms of the order of things, which is there is a physical interaction thing to this, and there's a level of working with it. So sometimes it's very kind of in your face when it comes to the Gurdjieff stuff, which is he's not very polite at times, as a lot of teachers in his tradition are. That's actually called the way of blame, the tradition that he comes out of. Now, Bennett was an interesting case. As I said, he discovered Gurdjieff because he was spying on him as part of British intelligence. And Bennett would eventually, work for oil companies, and he was somebody who had a promising political career, but instead he really wanted to work with the ideas. So what he did was he met Gurdjieff, and he had the opportunity to work with Gurdjieff at the Priory, which was Gurdjieff's Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man that lasted about 10 years there, from 1922 to 32 in France. And Bennett went there, but since there was a split with Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, it was like you had to choose one or the other. And Bennett chose Ouspensky, who he worked with for 20 years. And eventually they had a falling out because Bennett started teaching the system on his own. Ouspensky will die, and then Bennett will go back to Gurdjieff after 25 years and be like, Ouspensky's dead, and I'm teaching on my own. I have nowhere to go, And Gurdjieff welcomes him back, and he becomes an important feature of the last 2 years of Gurdjieff's life, taking that information. Bennett will also go on to, interview incredible yogis and do this spiritual search his whole life and open these different institutes to experiment with the Gurdjieff ideas, Sufic dancing, and, just a whole range of different things that he learned from Gurdjieff. And I do feel that, the echo of Bennett's work is very much alive in what we see today. This is Bennett actually with Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect. Remember, Frank Lloyd Wright's wife was a Gurdjieff, one of the big Gurdjieff teachers, and she had her own very unusual groups. But Bennett always, sort of penetrating, looking for how do we change this? Because Bennett sees that societal collapse coming. So what he decides to do is he says, look, Gurdjieff is putting out Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, which is his masterwork. Ouspensky is dead, and In Search of the Miraculous comes out. Both these books are hitting. Nobody knows really what either of them mean, because Gurdjieff or Ouspensky haven't released any books about the system, interestingly enough. There's a short-term mention of a book coming out in about 1932. It takes 16 years for that book to come out that Gurdjieff wrote. He wrote a very short book, The Herald of the Coming Good, and there's a lot of unusual sidesteps with Gurdjieff. It's almost like he took pains not to put things out in a book in an easily digested form where people could fall asleep to it. Oh, I have the book. I tried it. Boom. everything had to be, how can I do this so it is alarming, so that it wakes the person up? And, there are all these super efforts and all these different techniques that Gurdjieff uses to keep us on, a razor edge of being awake. But the books, I think, do serve, in Western culture, there's something fundamental about the way that we learn. And so I think where he was in Central Asia and trying to work it through Russia and Europe was one thing, but once the work got to America, it's like people really needed the book to work with. And he also did other things. He brought his dancers over to do this incredible kind of whirling dervish type dance techniques, very unusual things that they would do, stop exercises where the whole company would stop on the spot. And sometimes they would almost stage dive. And when they would collide with the audience, nobody would feel anything. So
wow.
Yeah, it is early stage diving. So there's a lot going on there with what Gurdjieff is bringing over. But something that catches Bennett's eye is this whole thing about Tsar Moon and the bees. And he wants to know about Tsar Moon. So he's like, I'm going to be the guy who translates Gurdjieff's ideas down and hunts down his influences and see what he really is trying to tell us. Because Gurdjieff dies in 1949, and then all that work is adrift because no one really understands it. But Ouspensky's book, which is the breakdown of Gurdjieff's work from 1915 to 1921, becomes a bestseller. So there's all these questions, and everyone's curious. What is this fourth way we've never heard of? And we're going to find its origins are quite fascinating, in fact. But let's look at the bee here. A lot of people might be familiar with this unusual carving at Abydos in Egypt, which was found under another carving, and so there was hidden by the priests. As we can see with the interesting kind of helicopter and airship, tank, and everything else that's going on here, this one just without a doubt shows that the ancient Egyptians had a high technology. But what is it that's hanging out in the back? It is that bee there. And that bee representing, again, the keeper of the honey of that knowledge of an ancient time, in this case Atlantis, as Gurdjieff will point out in Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. In fact, Gurdjieff goes to these great lengths to paint himself as, I'm not like Theosophy, I'm not like Anthroposophy, and all the rest of it. But the truth is, there's an awful lot of incredible crossover, including Atlantis and psychic experience, all these different things, but certainly enough to say that he was widely influenced by them and certainly aware of them. We know that Ouspensky, in fact, gave speeches to them, and that J.G. Bennett, I found out, had, before he was going to be Gurdjieff's apprentice, he was going to be Steiner's apprentice. Mm. So we could see that Bennett was aware of all sides of that equation.
Is there any chance that he regretted his choice after the fact?
Well, he did get to see Steiner lecture. I know that. So he certainly had enough to be able to tell. Now, another piece. So we've got the bees now. That's a shot of the Ellery Caves. Now, I want to mention these because they come up in Gurdjieff's work talking about these schools, but then they also come up in Theosophy through Emma Britton. And she does her whole thing about the initiates. And this, her breakthrough book is all about these initiates at the Ellery Caves. Then we think about Helena Blavatsky and the Ascended Masters. And this is also deep in the earth, and Shambhala and all these different things. We're going to find that these have very literal references as well as the large-scale kind of metaphorical references. That is also a picture from these Ellery Caves. There's no question it was a deep, deep initiation center. Olivia, see that?
Beautiful.
Isn't that remarkable? So we're looking at something where there's a tradition about the Mount. Remember the Mount? Remember Moses and the Mount? And God seeing him on the Mount and it becoming the sacred place? And so if you go over and you look at the Native American spirituality and through the book by Black Elk, again, he's in the mountain and he has that incredibly transformative vision. If you go through the Casey work, when he is Rata, he is going through this incredible period where he's exiled. And what does he do? He goes into the Mount. So the Mount, there's some deep, deep significance to this that we don't understand, and it's representational and it's literal. So when, the first 9/11 attack happened and we were bombing Afghanistan, and I noticed that they were saying, we're using bunker busters, which is really, really deep stuff. And I kept thinking to myself, I wonder if they're trying to bomb those schools out of existence. It would make sense. They're hard to get at. And Afghanistan is a hard to get at place. We know that from the Russians and the British, it's very hard to go in there. And now the US disaster after 20 years, which was always overblown. There was no reason to ever go in there and take over. There were always sites that you could say, oh, they're developing terrorism. But the idea, that bin Laden was in a cave orchestrating this stuff, these are the types of things that I looked at that helped me to understand just how much of a fraud the regular story that we get is. And that's kind of one of the big reasons I do dark journalism. I had studied how we did air defense and the types of air defenses that we had because of the Cold War. And in the Reagan era in particular, they had solidified a program for it. When the Cold War went away because the Soviet Union fell, the defense structure didn't, because they were planning for nations of concern. Some third world country would get a high-powered aircraft. And so we had things in place to repel a nuclear attack. The idea that we could be surprised by a guy in a cave in Afghanistan and box cutter guys and all that stuff was a complete joke to me. So I understood that very early on in terms of the stories that we get. That was a complete non-starter. But I wondered a lot about the bunker busters because I remembered that the Gurdjieff work took place in Afghanistan. So I went back into the Gurdjieff work and thinking, this is like 20 years ago now. And I'm thinking to myself, I need to understand whatever this stuff is better. So the Gurdjieff work, for me, it's highly personal work because you're working on yourself, but there is an international element to it, which is they're trying to prevent a societal collapse where people on the ground and the civilization doesn't have the tools to go forward. So what they're trying to do is release those tools in small groups. And, the way that Bennett described Gurdjieff discussing it with him was around 100 people per group. So not, large scale internet. It could be all around the world, but it seems like it worked better in these groups. So when we think about that and we think about the types of things, that the tools that they're giving us the tools to develop a small piece of humanity that's willing to step up to these higher things. But it's so public in that there's so much of the information is public. However, it's very incomplete in its public form. So I still feel that all of the work related to either anthroposophy or the Casey work or the Fourth Way, there's so much of it there that is completely untapped by this culture. And yet so many of us have found it. And it's, it doesn't need any explanation. The stuff is remarkable work. So, but I think we have to keep this in mind when we get on the international stage and Afghanistan shows up and something as dramatic as, the fall of Saigon and the American exit takes place before our eyes. And Biden comes out, sort of half programmed, not saying anything that makes any sense at all. Like, oh, those damn Afghans, they let us down, and sometimes you leave stuff behind, including $1 trillion worth of arms. Something very strange took place in relation to this. So if we just go back into this earlier period, about a century before, all the things that we're seeing taking place, what's going on? The mystery schools are having people like Gurdjieff go out, training them, and to go out into the world to present these things. And then you look back on it and you say, well, Gurdjieff died around 1950. What has the culture done with this incredible awakening? And some people have really got it. It really has woken some people up. Just like Steiner's work. And these things continue. You know, they're ongoing. And you can always say that there are pieces of it which you'd be surprised where it shows up. You know, there are a number of celebrities, if you go into their past, people like Elvis, you know, that you just wouldn't suspect it. And if you go into them a little bit, you'll find lots of deep esoteric interest. So certainly this stuff has that deep, deep qualities. Yes.
So, you know, what you're saying is that ultimately there's an occult war going on. It's the war of the mystery schools. Underneath, on the surface, we can see, you know, global geopolitical issues, economics, all of that, you know, banking interests, mining rights. But underneath, but they like, what does Catherine say? It's stacking functions.
Stacking functions, yes.
Yeah. So, and that's one of them.
Yeah, there's no question. Well, let's get into that for a moment, because there's a weird piece that I mentioned with the Uyghurs. And this gets into who was there in that part of Afghanistan where originally Gurdjieff said some of the mystery schools that he trained in were. If you go really far back, it's quite unusual. And I'll read a couple of passages from this. You're going to go back and find a weird group called the Tokaroi. And the Tokaroi, it's believed, came out of Iran and went to Central Asia and even spread over as far as the Chinese, because into China, because the Chinese have these different accounts of this unusual blonde group. Let's look at some of these blue-eyed blondes taking territory. Now, there's some references left to them. Their language is incredibly well developed and very different for that part of the world. This is an early picture of these Tokaroi. And of course, I'm very aware of that sound of the, you know, the two-eye stone has that same OI at the end. And then I think of that Tokaroi. Again, we have a little bit of that Tuatha and, you know, that feeling of that Irish mythical group as well flowing out there. These unusual people who show up with a strange appearance and take over. Well, these guys have a strange tie-over in that eventually the Uyghurs are associated with this group. And these are the types of buildings in that part of the world that are left from these eras. And these would be the types of buildings that Gurdjieff would have been working in and doing his, working for these mystery schools. Now, this group is also called the Yuezhi, Y-U-E-Z-H-I. And if you do just a little bit of background on them, a lot of strange things show up. They are nomads related to other Iranian peoples who moved from Gansu in Western China into Afghanistan and India, where they established a large, powerful empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, this is really quite remarkable because in the Gurdjieff work, it's really when he gets into that Afghanistan, Turkestan, this region, that's where the deeper schools are. He never wants to point exactly to where those are because Bennett said he took great pains to obscure the track to where the schools were that taught him. And of course, it's one of the hotter secrets of the whole thing. Again, we have this blonde, blue-eyed thing going on in this region with these people. So a nomadic confederation of 5 tribes from Eastern Central Asia, who in the 2nd century began migrating westwards. Now, Mongolia, we get a whole piece of this. But the piece that attracted my attention was that they were simultaneously encouraged by the weakness of the Bactrian kingdom. And they come into this area of Bactria. And that's where we're going to find there are a lot of legends, and even it's hinted at that the name Shambhala may be from Bactria. So let's see how I can round this out. There's also a very interesting hill of gold that's uncovered just before the Afghanistan conflict with the Soviets, where this guy finds this hill of ancient gold, and it's related to these peoples, but he's not able to excavate the whole thing. There are still some pictures of it online, but again, it's the Yuezhi, and we have this tie over, so it's the Tokaroi Yuezhi Uyghur connection. How's that?
Wow.
And gold is a big piece of it. And remember, in the Gurdjieff work, in Meetings with Remarkable Ben, one of the things that he's doing is he goes over to the Gobi city, and he's on an archaeological expedition looking for the lost city of gold. Well, oddly enough, in the Casey work, he talks all about the gold city that's in the Gobi and that will be uncovered, but it's incredibly advanced. They have sound weapons, they have elevators, they have flying machines. And this would be right around the period of the fall of Atlantis. So it's like an echo of that advanced technology. And so much of the culture and the memory of Mu in Asia is from this early Gobi city. One last thing before we move on from the Tokaroi, which is there's something called Maitreya Amit Tanaka. I'm sure I'm butchering that. Maitreya Amit Inataka. That's it. It's a Buddhist drama in the language known as Tocharian. It dates to the 8th century and survives only in fragments. It's an old Uyghur translation of the Tocharian text. Note the loop there from the Tocharians to the Uyghurs. It is much more complete text and dates to the 10th century. The drama revolves around the Buddha Maitreya. Remember Lord Maitreya, who's going to come and be the world teacher? Krishnamurti is going to host this Maitreya. Well, Buddha Maitreya is the future savior of the world. This story has been popular among the Buddhists, and parallel versions can be found in Chinese, Tibetan, and so on, also known as Encounters with Maitreya. The fragment of the Tocharian text come forth with 6 different manuscripts, and they go through the text a little bit. And oddly enough, this language of the Tocharians, the Tokaroi, has them, they wonder so much about this language as it doesn't have any parallel in the area. So we have, remember, this group coming over from the northern edge of Iran, moving out into Central Asia. And you can find some odd things about that too, because Casey talks all about this group from his lifetime there as Yolt, when that is a major center of healing and people are going there for spiritual renewal. And that's in Iran. And then he also speaks that the original Garden of Eden, as we know it, is also a reference to a place in Iran. So we have something unusual about the territory there for sure. The only other thing I want to say in relation to the Tokaroi is that let's look just for a moment at what they're doing with the Uyghurs. Now, the Uyghurs have, different appearances, but one of the Uyghurs that I have here that I saw, again, their appearance is very different from what you see there in that part of the world, right? There's a kind of blonde, blue-eyed
Absolutely.
thing. And the Uyghurs are, as I said, being genocided, being tortured, being tracked. And the Chinese government feels like they have carte blanche. Everywhere there are human rights campaigns by legitimate groups trying to bring attention to this, and using images like this, where they've built camps for these Uyghurs on the Chinese side, trying to say, hey, our way or the highway, you extremists, we're not going to tolerate. And I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take your kids and make them slaves. And we're also going to monitor you, and we're going to take you to re-education camps, and we're going to do the whole Nazi thing on you. And you know what? No one's going to say anything because Biden is very comfortable with the CCP. But the whole world should be outraged by this. And in fact, Apple and all those companies should move their stuff completely out of China over this, because you might as well be working on Hitler 2.0 and complete extermination of a group. Now, in relation to the crisis in Afghanistan, let's think about this for a moment. This is a very unusual story. Interview. This is from yesterday. Taliban sharing info with China poses a danger to the Uyghurs. Quote, there is fear Kabul will help China identify Uyghurs and have them deported back to China, says a U.S. scholar. That story came right out of the BBC. Why would they want, this group that they're having tremendous problems with, why would they want them back? If they've fled to Afghanistan, why would China even want them?
Totally.
You have to wonder.
Mm-hmm.
It goes beyond a regular situation, doesn't it?
Extermination, right?
Yes. Excellent point. That's exactly my point, which is they want to exterminate the Uyghurs. Why? Why would you want to exterminate a group? Genocide of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Since 2014, Uyghurs in Xinjiang have been affected by extensive controls and restrictions which the Chinese government have imposed upon their religious, cultural, economic, and social lives. The Chinese government has expanded police surveillance to watch for signs of religious extremism. Sounds like Homeland Security. Hey, how are they doing with that 250,000 employees, huh? How you like paying for that? 250,000 employees who are looking back at you, trying to figure out, should we put them in a camp and track them? I know I love my tax dollars going for that. All right, check this out. The Chinese government has expanded police surveillance to watch for signs of religious extremism that include owning books about Uyghurs. Well, if you are a Uyghur, then, you probably will own books about Uyghurs. Growing a beard. You grow a beard in China, you're out. That's it. Having a prayer rug. Yeah, so if you have a prayer rug, forget it. Or quitting smoking and drinking. So if you're straight edge, forget it. They want you. They want you to be boozing and smoking it up, because if you're not, it means, you're on this kind of Uyghur extremist path. The government has also installed cameras into the homes of private citizens. So I'm going to come in and, here comes a chopper to chop off your head. That is 1984 come to life. This is why the Chinese government has no moral authority to lead the world. As much as the United States has fallen down on the job, the Chinese are not the answer. And, everywhere we look around the world, it's an upside down world, because the leaders that we have are nowhere near on the level of the people. And yet we have to understand they're a reflection of the people's apathy. And this is really, I think, the main problem. But let's go a little further with this, because I think the Uyghurs tie-in with some of these early brotherhoods is part of the thing that's putting a target on their back. At least 120,000, possibly over 1 million. That's a pretty big range. Let's go with the million, because we know the Chinese lie anyway. The Chinese government, that is. The people are fantastic. The Uyghurs are detained in mass detention camps, termed re-education camps. How novel. Aimed at changing the political thinking of detainees, their identities, and their religious beliefs. Some of these facilities keep prisoners detained round the clock, while others release their inmates at night to return home. Hey, that's nice, huh? Let them out. According to Chinese government operating procedures, the main feature of the camps is to ensure adherence to Chinese Communist Party ideology. Inmates are continuously held captive in the camps for a minimum of 12 months, depending on their performance on Chinese ideology tests. If you fail your tests, you're back in prison. The New York Times has reported inmates are required to sing hymns praising the Chinese Communist Party. Oh, glorious leader. And write self-criticism essays. I am such a bad Uyghur for being a Uyghur. And that the prisoners are also subjected to physical and verbal abuse by prison guards. Chinese officials are sometimes assigned to monitor the families of current inmates, and women have been detained due to actions of their husbands. So it's a complete, if you think the Taliban are bad, what the hell is that? That's a country that is a rich country. It's a country that is admitted to the UN. It's a country that is, in the World Trade Organization. They don't have they should be thrown out of all those things until they release the Uyghurs. I mean, it's quite sick when you think about what's going on. Let's get the background on the Uyghurs here. Mao declared the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. He turned Second East Turkestan Republic. So they did a number of different things there. And what happened was the largest group, the largest minority left was the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs the Uyghurs have this kind of persecution history. It seems like they've been targets. But remember also that the Chinese went after Tibet, and that they also went after the Dalai Lama, and we got the Dalai Lama out. In fact, China is so draconian in using these rules that they actually hunted down what they thought was the reincarnation, the coming reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. So they're on the lookout for him.
Oh, they haven't found anyone.
No,
Okay.
they're looking for who's going to replace this Dalai Lama.
Wow.
And so, but they're using the whole, hey, if we can keep our eye out for that's reincarnation surveillance. How'd you like to be under that? So there are these, free Uyghur campaigns that have been going on. But one of the interesting things that I found is that, they've been destroying their sites, but that they're interested in having them chipped. And they want them biometrically tracked. So the government denied the existence of the camps initially, but then changed their stance to claim that the camps serve to combat terrorism and give vocational training to the Uyghur people. Activists have called for the camps to be open to visitors to prove their function. Media groups report they can't get in there. No, it's just a torture camp. It's like, these guys have a lot in common with North Korea. In fact, that's why they cover for North Korea. You notice North Korea has been kind of quiet lately. All right. Now, the lengthy isolation periods between Uyghur men and women have been interpreted by some analysts as an attempt to inhibit Uyghur procreation in order to change the ethnic demographics of the country. In October 2018, an expose by BBC News claimed, based on analysis of satellite imagery collected over time, that hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs were interned in rapidly expanding camps. It's also been reported in 2019 that hundreds of writers, artists, and academics had been imprisoned in what the magazine qualified as an attempt to punish any form of religious or cultural expression among Uyghurs. Hey, listen, if you're good at writing songs, directing movies, painting pictures, you're out. Parallel to the forceful detainment of millions of adults in 2017 alone, at least 500,000 children were also forcefully separated from their families and placed in preschool camps with prison-style surveillance system and 10,000-volt electric fences.
Oh, my God.
So what the Uyghurs are up against is, complete tyranny on the Chinese side, but the kind of persecution that lends itself to Holocaust-style persecution. Again, why? What is the deeper kind of occult significance of what they're doing beyond the incredible human rights violation of it? So the piece that I find interesting is the tie-over of this group now, which is the Tokaroi, to the Uyghurs, and what that connection represents. Now, there's more about the Uyghurs, but I'm going to have to move on from that. But you can see they're definitely trying to persecute this group, and it seems like of any group on Earth right now, these guys are just being targeted. And you remember that they did this when we saw the Yazidi targeting going on. They were doing that also with these groups the thug groups they had thrown out there to do this. And the Yazidis, again, are part of that weird kind of mystical alliance that's aligned with the Mystery Schools and are deeply known for their kind of wild psychic religion. Okay, let's get a few answers. First of all, I wanted to mention this, and that there's letters between Ouspensky and different people in England during the Russian Revolution, but some of it sounded so prescient and so much like the things that we're witnessing today. I mean, this is really shocking. So this is a series of letters. It's letters from Russia in 1918, which I think are very important as a snapshot of what's going on there. During the first 6 or 9 months of the revolution, no such center existed. They're talking about the Volunteer Army Center. Russia was then represented by Bolshevism made in Germany, united with real Russian profiteering and fostered by the absurd idealism of the intelligentsia who quoted the text, "Do not overcome evil by evil." Sounds a little like the Google "don't be evil," right? In the face of the weakness of the intelligentsia, Bolshevism very soon showed its real face. It became openly to wage war on culture, to destroy all cultural values, and to annihilate the intelligentsia as the representative of culture. The nihilism of former times was already well acquainted with contempt for culture, as if the only valuable results of the progress of humanity were high explosives. Don't allow them to think or do anything culture, just think about making bombs, basically. Bolshevism developed the idea to the utmost. Everything they did not help or foster, that did not help or foster the production of bombs, was declared to be valueless, bourgeoisie, and deserving only of destruction and contempt. This point of view was very acceptable to the imagination of the proletarians, the workmen, so they manipulated these groups against each other. It sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Sounds exactly like what we're going through now. And finally, he says, the journalism was all stripped down and taken out, as well as all of the arts departments and medical departments. They were all replaced with these thugs, just like we're seeing now. Their place was taken by official, semi-official, illiterate Bolshevik news, or pravdas. In indescribable forms, these papers praised the Soviet power and poured out contempt on the bourgeoisie. An unofficial paper, Socialist, was allowed to be printed on condition that it formally supported Bolshevism. Recognized the Soviet power was the official expression. This meant the recognition of this power as democratic and the best in the world. It involved also the necessity of expressing the loyalty of the paper by publishing defamations and denouncements of the bourgeoisie and by vile criticism of everything that was not immediately connected with Bolshevism. So we can see so much of this, like MSNBC now is the same front for that, CNN. They are working through these groups to try to create this thing. Oh, this group, they're not doing experimental injections. This other group supports political positions we don't agree with. This other group is against China. We're against them. This is exactly the same type of setup. I just find the parallel fascinating. 100 years later, again, 100 years. Officially, the struggle was directed against the bourgeoisie, but this term, in its Bolshevik interpretation, embraced the whole of the intelligentsia. All persons belonging to the professions, professors, artists, doctors, engineers, and generally all specialists were proclaimed bourgeois indiscriminately and subjected to the control of their own workmen and servants. In a way, their position was worse than that of the journalists. The latter were sometimes left alone, but doctors, engineers, and civil servants were forced to work under the most incredible conditions. Workmen and guards controlled their engineers. Doctors were superseded by councils of patients and porters. This is not a joke. It is real life, and obtains at this moment in Soviet Russia in the spring of 1919, notwithstanding the difficulties created by Bolshevism. The doctors of Soviet Russia assembled in the yearly Gurdjieff meeting, held in honor of the late well-known surgeon Gurdjieff. The evidence collected on that occasion showed that the doctors were quite helpless in combating epidemics, owing to the control exercised over them by medical attendants who filled all the responsible offices. It was a war on the culture across the board. This is Ouspensky writing an actual letter to people in Britain who have no idea that any of this is happening because they're so good at keeping the news down. So the lesson, I guess the takeaway for us is that these people like Ouspensky and like Gurdjieff lived through times very much like the times that we're in now. They also went through World War II as well. But I think the Russian Revolution in particular, with the takeover of the culture and things that we know traditionally, we have seen it in journalism for sure. We've seen it through Netflix and all that kind of nonsense, Hollywood, the music industry, and all the rest. Anything that steps out of line that is not the culture, the woke culture that they're trying to build for control, which is completely insane, they have it lined up so that you're out. And those power centers have been taken over. And slowly but surely, what did they do? They created the Soviet state out of what was a relatively free Russia. The czars were there, and there were problems, there were cultural issues. But this thing, they went from the frying pan into the furnace, because in this case, they got full on Stalinism. You disagree with the government, you're going to the gulag, and all the rest of it. And by the way, we're taking all your property and anything else you might have. So, these periods and these areas of pressure come back on us. One of the important things that Gurdjieff left us with was, he said in 1948, look, you have a chance, you have an opportunity. You can work with these ideas. You've got enough time here between now and the next big kind of world war, big crisis, which is the period we're in now. And if these ideas are applied by enough people and if enough of these groups strategize with each other, one, they can survive this kind of societal cataclysm, the collapse, and they can rebuild into something else. Or two, they can prevent and move the culture out of the way altogether. That's what they were building toward. So I'm going to get a couple of references in here for Tsar Moon and how that's set up in Gurdjieff's thinking, but I think that gives us something of an idea for what we're talking about. Yes, Miss Olivia.
A cult fan wants to know, that Ouspensky book came out during the pandemic of 1918.
Yes.
What did Gurdjieff, Bennett, and Ouspensky have to say about such things?
They did, there are references to everything being used or manipulated for financial purposes or war purposes. And, they talk a lot. It's interesting. If you read Beelzebub's Tales, he talks a lot about scientists making fruit that on the outside looks delicious, but inside is basically like chemical disease. And I'm looking at that and thinking, this book was written in the 1940s, so just think about this thing, has been going on for almost a century. But I do feel that they did have to go through this, and the strain that they went through 100 years ago is the echo, just as Steiner had said, there'd be an echo and an opportunity. The 100-year cycle thing is an esoteric matter. There's no question about it. But we know we're in that period, and we know also what they've left for us. So if we can drill down the message that they left for us and use the techniques and move it through that century, then we go to an entirely different place. But this is a very small window, I believe, to do it in. Yes.
You want another question?
Yeah, go for it.
This is a good one. Val wants to know, Steiner did not trust Gurdjieff and considered him a trickster at best, if not an outright con man. What do you know about this?
Well, there wasn't a great deal of material out about Gurdjieff, so I don't know where Steiner would get that impression from. You're going to have to maybe give me a source on that. I know that, Ouspensky was aware of Steiner. Casey did readings about Steiner and Ouspensky, as I mentioned, and Blavatsky. Casey recommended Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine and also recommended Tertium Organum. I think in that whole run, William James also, Varieties of Religious Experience, and some other very interesting ones like Charles Dickens and things as sort of fundamental spiritual. But I want to say that in relation to Steiner Steiner could be very opinionated. So if he had come across Gurdjieff, he could have. But there wasn't a great deal of publicity about Gurdjieff during Steiner's lifetime. So that would be an interesting one to explore. I haven't heard of Steiner's taking down of Gurdjieff. I know that Gurdjieff took down Crowley when Crowley went to visit the priory in France, and Gurdjieff was just like, he was a recovering heroin addict at that point, Crowley. And so at a certain point, he was there for a week, I think, recovering, but I think he was causing trouble. And Gurdjieff, they had a face off, and Gurdjieff was like, "You're out of here." And Crowley was like, he was Crowley. But I think that it is kind of interesting. We also have reports that FDR, who had tremendous desire to cure his physical ailments and, made him essentially crippled. And he tried all these holistic things on the side. But there's a report that he went to the Gurdjieff Institute for 10 days before he assumed the presidency there in 1932. So maybe around 1931, 1930. I found that very interesting. And I know that Gurdjieff worked at very high levels of different governments. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Wow.
I've got a comment here about this. Okay, so Lois says Henry Barnes, the door watcher at is it the Goetheanum? Is that how you pronounce it?
Goetheanum, yes.
Goetheanum. In the 60s to the 80s, said Steiner came to the door when Gurdjieff tried to enter and forbid him entry.
Wait. Well, this is pretty interesting. I don't know. I don't know about that story. It's a little tricky. Here's the thing. The Goetheanum was set up, and, then it was burnt down by the Nazis, and it was a great shock. So I don't know about the stories about Steiner having an attitude towards Gurdjieff. I don't know. You're going to have to give me if you email me at dj@darkjournalist.com, give me a really solid source for that, because it sounds like a lot of hooey, frankly. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're here. This is episode X Series 106. We're going deep. And who knows? Maybe Steiner did encounter Gurdjieff. We know that Bennett attended a Steiner lecture and almost became his right-hand man. And I think that Steiner died at the point where J.G. Bennett was going to do that. And then he went to choose, do I do Bennett? Do I do Ouspensky? Do I do Gurdjieff? And he ended up going with Ouspensky for 20 years. So there's a lot of switching around there, but certainly these are incredible heavy hitters. I think that Bennett's work is underappreciated because he brought so much of this into the next stage. And I think he did with it what is supposed to be done with it, which is you extrapolate the teaching and you don't stop learning it. You try to expand on it without changing the character of the thing by experimenting along the lines of what they were doing. And I think that this is maybe what gives Bennett an edge. But, when these people die, so much of the force goes with them. And it never seems like the person who follows up has the stature, So when people do great work about Casey, or they do great work about Steiner, everyone, not everyone can be a Steiner or a Casey or an Ouspensky. That's not important. But it does seem interesting that when that movement hits, it seems that the individual is really the one radiating it out. And seldom do we get the excellent students who can carry on the work in the same kind of dynamic tradition. But certainly we've seen people do their best. Let's jump to some of Bennett's descriptions, because as I said, I don't think he gets enough credit on this. There's some things here that the Sarmon Brotherhood taught Gurdjieff. This is one of them, which is the Enneagram. The Enneagram is a deep esoteric symbol, which is the symbol for the Sarmon Brotherhood. It's slightly altered Remember the B Brotherhood, right? BEE. So this is the group that taught Gurdjieff. Now there you can see the Enneagram, but it's missing what? It's missing that triangle in the middle, which makes it a 9-point star. So something about that triangle is the piece. So now we have the Tsar Moon design, but now we have this sort of triangle piece in the middle. That gives us the whole kind of thrust of the passing down of this image in those brotherhoods. And what we can say about the Enneagram is interesting, because Gurdjieff, when he came over and taught about it, he said, you know, they might say, well, you know, you're releasing this Enneagram and it could be misused. However, his point was they won't know how to use it. They won't know how to misuse it. But it's completely original on Gurdjieff's side, and it had never appeared in any Western media, book, study, or anything. There might be something similar to it back in like the times of Pythagoras or something, but there's nothing. Gurdjieff brought this out, just like he brought the stop exercise out, just like he brought self-remembering out. So much of his work is completely original. And I would say that around, say, the Theosophical era of 1875, all these groups and all these things came out, Golden Dawn and everything. But a lot of it was a replay of Theosophy. The Gurdjieff stuff comes from, like, what is this about? This is completely different. You're going to have to apply yourself physically. You're going to have to do counting exercises. You're going to have to watch the different eyes go by. It's like this incredible combination of things that he learned in deep ministries and monasteries that had been kept secret for centuries. And so they had not seen the light of day. Just like when Theosophy came out, you know, she's talking about reincarnation, and, you know, she's going very deep on these masters and ascended masters guiding humanity and all, you know, everything from yoga and everything else. Everyone's looking around like, what? Where did this come from? And it's being written by a woman who was from Russia in 1875. I mean, you know, it's quite unusual.
Can I throw you a question?
Yes, please.
Oldest Dirt wants to know how many triangles are in that diagram?
Well, as you can see, there's different ways for you to look at that. But there's one clear triangle, and then there's the symbol itself. The symbol itself is not a triangle, but it has a very odd flavor to it. Sans triangle. And some people have suggested that it was a gate.
Ooh, I like that.
Others, Gurdjieff himself, when he referred to it, he said to Ouspensky, you can't understand it unless you think of it as moving. And then when they did the sacred dances and the Gurdjieff movements, they would have them do it along a floor drawing of the Enneagram. And so, you know, the idea of the Enneagram moving, they're moving over it. So we've seen what happened was the Enneagram thing got bastardized because it got picked up. It even became like a board game at a certain point in the 1990s. Very strange things happened with it. And there were people who were authors of it who were like, guess your type. And there was a whole group of people out of the blue who were like, we're Enneagram teachers, and we got it all from the secret brotherhood in South America. What it was, they had picked up the Enneagram, and they didn't want to share the copyright on the work they were going to do with it. The Enneagram was brought to the West by Gurdjieff. The idea that some other group in South America was using it and it represented all this personality stuff was totally different. Now, types was a very important piece of Gurdjieff work, and the Enneagram as types is completely plausible, but it's interpretive, so it had nothing to do with some other South American group. There was never any evidence for that. And I think Oscar Acaso was one of the people who put that theory out. And they found out later that he was doing it to prevent himself in a court case. There's another really major guy who did that. But basically, always go to the original, which is straight from the Gurdjieff work. I did want to say that, all of the archives of P.D. Ouspensky got donated to Yale. And one of the things that they found was the Fourth Way book, the original title. I'm going to show you this. The original title, The Way Out. That's what we're talking about. Just like the gate with the Enneagram. Somehow, the way out of what? Well, it seems to be the way out of this kind of very binding physical reality, very binding societal reality, very limited thinking reality of the 20th into the 21st century. And that they knew we were getting buckled down into this hunkered down, concretized. And just as Steiner suggested, the mystery schools got together and said, we have to do something about the scientific materialism because they'll forget the spiritual nature that they came here with, and they won't be recognizable. They'll literally separate themselves off from a deep part of themselves. Well, that's exactly what was going to happen. And instead, this flash flood of incredible information, psychic information, reincarnation, theosophy, anthroposophy, the Gurdjieff work, the Edgar Cayce work, Atlantis, it was all there as a counterpunch to the Ahrimanic destiny that was being built, this transhumanism thing. Now it's all out in the open, and we've had access to that information. That's the kind of stuff that in the 16th or 17th century could have gotten you thrown in jail for life or burned at the stake, right? And we have it just easily available at our fingertips. So what have we done with it? Have these groups put this information forward for us to do something with it. What have we done with it? Well, certainly a number of people have learned it has an incredible effect on people's understanding. Have we done enough with it? Did the people who gave it to us, did they do enough with it? Did Gurdjieff do enough with it? The question is, we always have to do more. That's really the answer, I think. And yet, there's some powerful impulse that comes out of all of this. And that's really what we're looking at. I'm going to go to a
Hold on. You can't go on yet. Okay. So everybody, and I personally am very interested in this, the way out thing. So Najat is asking, is the way out of a portal? Is it the way out of samsara? Is it the way out of cyclical time systems of control? What are we talking about here?
Well, really, when you go into the Gurdjieff work, he talks all about laws. And the more unaware, the more asleep that an individual is, the more laws that they fall under. Now, the ultimate laws in this realm are the moon. That's the heaviest. That has the most amount of laws. Many of the physical laws you can get around. You cannot be subject to if you are on a different spiritual evolution track. So it's the way out of being contained by so many of those laws that apply to sleeping individuals, such as the law of accident, falling under the law of accident, for example. It is a law. And yet there is something about falling under the law of accident that can be avoided through conscious application. So those types of things run deep, but certainly you're getting at the same thing, which is if it's the way out, you're coming out of being subjected to what? This is what we're talking about.
So is this a prison? Is Earth a prison from the system? Is that one way of looking at it?
I think it can be.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be. Certainly, if it is considered from a mundane level, certainly it can be hellish. If you think about the society at large and the things that make up the aims of that society, then that's kind of very, very limiting. And, it's also destructive and it's coarse. So it starts to lose that sense of its own humanity. And that is descending into, for want of a better word, a kind of hell. But remember, we started the show off with talks with the devil, right? What are these concepts, hell and the devil? They represent a severance from one's higher spiritual nature. This is what the fourth way and these things are getting after. Let's look at something about Tsar Moon real quick. I found this interesting. Again, going back to, I have some good pictures of Gurdjieff here. Again, going back to this idea of the Afghanistan part. This is actually Gurdjieff coming back and being somewhat triumphant there from Europe to America and founding, doing a number of different things in 1924, working with someone named A.R. Orage, who is very fascinating, and he started the term New Age, came from the work of Orage, and he had a magazine called The New Age, and he was a very dynamic guy who everyone thought, hey, this guy is going to be the new Ouspensky, because Ouspensky had split off with Gurdjieff, but in fact, it didn't work out that way. But Orage did all the New York work with Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff himself was always saying that he was experimenting. So he was taking his groups and he was trying to create something with it. He said one of the great threats around bringing in this period, and why they were bringing out this incredible work, is something called false initiates that he referred to as criminal gangs. Think about that. So it gets us on that left-hand path school thing. It's that war of the mystery schools. There's a group functioning for humanity, on the side of humanity, and Bennett had identified them, the Khwaja Jagan. And this group has been working as kind of the world brotherhood to move the culture forward. So even the Sarmon Brotherhood, which is buried, beneath the sands of time, even they, are on one level, but this other group is somewhere deeper still, because Gurdjieff could actually find the Sarmon Brotherhood. Let's get into a few things about Sarmon. Bennett said that there was something about Zoroaster that was connected with Sarmon. The word can be interpreted in three ways. This is Bennett. It is the word for bee, which has always been a symbol of those who collect precious honey of traditional wisdom and preserve it for further generations. Collection of legends, well known in Armenian and Syrian circles with the title of The Bees, was revised by Mar Solomon, an historian in the 13th century. The Bees refers to a mysterious power transmitted from the time of Zoroaster and made manifest in the time of Christ. Man in Persian, and its Persian meaning, as the quality transmitted by heredity, and hence a distinguished family or race. It can be the repository of an heirloom or tradition. The word Sar, S-A-R, means head, both literally and in the sense of principal or chief. So the combination Sar, man, would thus mean the chief repository of the tradition. Yet another possibility was those whose heads have been purified. In other words, the enlightened. That is Bennett's interpretation of the term Sarmon. Gurdjieff found the Sarmon when he was a hypnotist, and he was giving cures and helping people to do things like stop alcohol, drinking, abusing alcohol, and other things. And he was quite popular in this period doing this. He finally, in his searches, ran across the Sarmon Brotherhood and spent close to a decade with them. Some timelines have it as 5 years. It's not very clear exactly what the timeline was. In addition, there's also confusion about Gurdjieff's birth date himself, because there is a license, a driver's license, that shows 1872. His official date on his passport is 1877, and others have suggested, given the timeline that he recounts and things like Meeting with Remarkable Men, which is basically a bio, an autobiography, that's looking like he was born in 1864. So we have three different working dates for that. Go for it.
Would part of this be him not wanting people to cast charts on him astrologically?
Yeah, this is interesting, actually, because we see this in a lot of different, there's something about Blavatsky where these mystery school groups on the left-hand side and the right-hand side both knew that she was coming based on the astrology. So a lot of these spiritual teachers don't like to give their exact date of birth, and you'll find out even people like Jean Dixon, after the fact, we all learn, oh, it was actually a 5-year difference, or it was a different day, or something along that line. And very often it's for that reason, which is they don't want someone who is in an enemy camp being able to plot the things that are going to happen to them astrologically. So I think that that's pretty hardcore. And it is another one of these pieces of the Gurdjieff story that gets very strange. Let's go further with the Sarmon Brotherhood. Sarmoun, okay? Sometimes with a G in certain translations. So Sarmoun is basically how it sounds, the way I've heard it pronounced. And it's the bees, again. So here's what Gurdjieff writes. Our worthy father Televan has at last, he found a letter from one monk to another monk that was written in like the 12th century. And it said, our worthy father Televan has at last succeeded in learning the truth about the Sarmon Brotherhood. Their organization actually did exist near the town of Siranosh. And 50 years ago, soon after the migration of peoples, they migrated also and settled in the valley of Izruman, 3 days' journey from Nivisi. Then the letter went on about other matters. What struck us most was the word Sarmoun, with a G, which we had come across several times in the book called Merkabat. This word is the name of a famous esoteric school, which according to tradition was founded in Babylon as far back as 2500 BC, and which was known to have existed somewhere in Mesopotamia up to the 6th or 7th century AD. Then they fled. Where they fled to, apparently, was Afghanistan. This school was said to have possessed great knowledge containing the key to many secret mysteries. Many times had Pagosian and I. Pagosian is also named X, by the way. That's his other name that Gurdjieff gives him. He just calls him X. And I talked of this school and dreamed of finding out something authentic about it. And now suddenly we found it mentioned in this parchment. We were greatly excited. So he sets out for years and doesn't find it. It takes a long, long time to find it. And there is a recurring character in his search when he finds the map through the priest and all these other things. And it's this Prince Lubavetsky, who is from Russia and is very cultured and is on the same search as Gurdjieff. He's a very unusual character, and his name was hidden because Lubavetsky is not the official name. What Bennett found out when he researched it is that the name Lubavetsky meant love of knowledge. So this guy was certainly a prince. He was certainly from Russia, but Lubavetsky was not the actual name, but it served the purpose. So Prince, love of knowledge. And when he finally ends up in the Sarmon Brotherhood, the Prince, love of knowledge, is there and gives him a very kind of serious, you've made it, you finally made it. And also tells him that he's dying. And, so he kind of hands off Gurdjieff to the school. Now, Major Desmond Martin, he has his own account of the Sarmon Brotherhood. This is a researcher. And he said the contemporary Sarmon Brotherhood was in the Hindu Kush Mountains. That's Afghanistan. And Gurdjieff also referenced the Brotherhood teaching him in Afghanistan. So it's very clear that's where it was, although they keep the actual location very secret. In the account, the motto of the Tsar Moon is the work produces a sweet essence. Work being not only work for God, but for others, and also self-work in relation to this. It is maintained that just as the bee accumulates honey, so the Tsar Moon accumulates, store, and preserve what they term true knowledge. So this guy describes a tree-like multi-jointed apparatus similar to the one described by Gurdjieff, and a no kunja, a 9-pointed figure similar to Gurdjieff's Enneagram. So this is very interesting. There are these other people. Idries Shah is another one. He had kind of sketchy dealings with Bennett, so there's a lot of information behind Idries Shah. There's no question about it, and it's worthy of study for sure. But it seems like the dynamic he had with Bennett was a little bit taking advantage of him. A lengthy account of an encounter with the Tsar Moon is given in Among the Dervishes. This is a book from 1973, about 25 years after Gurdjieff died, by someone named Omar Burke. And he describes the Tsar Moon as a diffuse set of groups rather than being located in a single monastery. Some groups have no permanent headquarters and meet in the open or private houses. In some cases, whole villages blend Tsar Moon practices. So one of the things I found interesting in here is that they were speaking in the 1970s of moving the Brotherhood, the mystery school, out of Afghanistan. Now, we know that the Soviets came in there in 79, so this may have been the reason why. And so they might have been long gone from there by the time we were using Buster bunkers for the 9/11 war. But I found the reference to it very, very interesting. And another book that mentions it is People of the Secret by Edward Campbell. So studies in extrasensory perception. There is, there's a number of interpretations around this. Gurdjieff is the one who gave it to us first, so I go to that source when I'm looking for information on that. A couple of quick things in relation to Gurdjieff and Bennett on this, and then we'll move on. How are you doing over there?
Great.
Okay, and you got questions? We'll be taking questions in about 10 minutes here. You're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 106. We're going deep on the mystery school warning and societal collapse, world in crisis, but transformation at hand through the work of G.I. Gurdjieff in the Fourth Way. We're going to be taking your questions here momentarily. Let's get a couple of quick things. I found this interesting. This is Gurdjieff and Bennett going over Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, the book that is kind of Gurdjieff's opus at the end of his life. And then he dies right after it's released. So he's comparing the fact that, look, in fact, Ouspensky's book is more palatable to the public in Search of the Miraculous, and it's really hard, and Beelzebub is a tongue twister, and it's intentionally obscure. If you think about it in terms of music, like you have bands that just have a flair for making commercial music and then really weird, great, obscure stuff. Well, this is an obscure album that's hard to interpret. When in 1948, after Ouspensky's death, the typescript of Fragments of an Unknown Teaching, which is the name of the book, came over, Gurdjieff had this read in front of him. He constantly remarked that the presentation was not as satisfactory as Beelzebub and insisted we should turn the latter as the authentic source. Now, this is interesting because he was also fascinated that Ouspensky had retained note for note so much of what Gurdjieff himself had taught between 1960 and 1921. But what he's saying is, my book, this thing, Beelzebub's Tale, I've worked on it. Now, my teaching has become better. I'm going to put this out. And Gurdjieff was very insistent that the publication of In Search of the Miraculous be deferred until Beelzebub had appeared and was on the market for a few months. The wish was ignored after he died, and the two books were brought out together. It might have been supposed that Ouspensky, with his love of clarity and simple expression, boulderized Gurdjieff's more difficult presentation to express the ideas in terms more acceptable to the reader. But this does not seem to have been the case. Ouspensky was more conscientious in his wish to convey just exactly what he had learned from Gurdjieff. This is true, he didn't add to it at all. When he inserted views of his own, for example, all his speculations about timescales in chapter 15 of In Search of the Miraculous, he quite frankly said these were his own ideas and not Gurdjieff's. Rather, it appears that Gurdjieff, having decided to throw open his ideas to anyone who chose to buy his books, wished to safeguard their real significance by making them accessible only to those who were prepared to make a very big effort. This is the theme over and over again in the Gurdjieff work. You're only going to get anywhere on any of this stuff if you're willing to make some kind of a super effort to discover it. Two last pieces here, also from this book. Bennett's book on Gurdjieff, Making a New World, has like, it's got the serious, hardcore background, and I recommend that and Bennett's autobiography, Witness, as well. This is interesting. These are masters of wisdom, the Khwaja Gan, who appear in history about 1,000 years ago. Strangely enough, the tradition of the masters is almost unknown in India. When Helena Blavatsky published her books, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, one of her chief claims was to have encountered in person some of the masters in or beyond Tibet. The belief in the masters then became an integral part of theosophical doctrine, but it acquired an occult character that weakened its credibility, not its substance. Much of the mystery in the Theosophical Masters derived from their supposed location in Tibet, though Helena Blavatsky herself asserted that their headquarters was beyond, in the mountains, in the legendary Shambhala. It never occurred to me that this place was more than a pure invention until, quite recently, Idries Shah suggested to me that its name could have been derived from Shams-i-Bak, the Bactrian Sun Temple. Who was at the Bactrian Sun Temple? The Tokaroi. Who were the descendants of the Tokaroi with the connections? The Uyghurs. So there's something in that Shambhala Brotherhood story. Here we have it through Blavatsky now. But that region again, Bactrian. The Bactrian Sun Temple, the ruins of which can still be seen at Balkh near the northern frontier of Afghanistan. Rudolf Steiner associated Balkh with Haran Rata, the center of Mithraic sun worship. So Steiner's saying the center of Mithraic sun worship was in Afghanistan. And Blavatsky is pointing to Shambhala. And then we have this very strange civilization that was advanced, that they find these temples, irrigation, the whole thing there in Afghanistan, and it's connected with this Tokaroi group. So something is going on there in relation to the movement of these traditions and them knowing, when to flee as well. One last thing on this group here, same book again. It is likely that the original custodians of the traditions were the Sarmon Brotherhood. We must find out all that we can about their origins and activities. Gurdjieff provides here another astonishing clue. He says that the society entitled The Earth is Equally Free for All. This is the name of the society. The Earth is Equally Free for All set out to establish in Asia a single religion, a single language, a single central authority. The religion they selected was to be based on that of the Parsis, only changing it a little. The language was to be Turkmen, the Turkish dialect spoken in Turkmenistan. By the way, the Uyghurs speak Turkish. And the central authority has to be established at Margan, the capital. No reference to the Parsi, the religion founded by Zoroaster, appears elsewhere in Gurdjieff's writings. And I just want to say that there's a character called Ashiata Shamash, which Gurdjieff stressed the importance to Bennett of. And the 3 chapters in Beelzebub that deal with it, I highly recommend reading them because I think they not only lay out the past, but they lay out what we're going into. And I think there's an opportunity and a warning in that work. But Ashiata Shamash, Ashiateshemash, is the most holy saint that Gurdjieff recounts in his, that he learned of there in the Sarmon Brotherhood. This saint, he has had this incredible impact through the brotherhoods. And he, Bennett believed, after researching it thoroughly and all the clues that Gurdjieff had given him, that this was Zoroaster. Now, I want to say something weird about Zoroaster. Zoroaster is recorded by Edgar Cayce as being around in 8000 BC, but the official personage of Zoroaster is 500 BC. So how do you get from 8000 to 500 BC? Well, either somebody's living for 7,500 years there, or there's some kind of transfer of the consciousness of this individual down through time. This is another piece that I wanted to suggest, which is if he's around in 8000 BC, here's another interesting thing from the Cayce readings. Cayce claims that Christ had an incarnation as someone named Zend in Iran in this 8000 BC period, and that he was the father of Zoroaster. So there's a lot to work with there. And then him showing up in the middle of the Gurdjieff work and then in the Steiner work, there's something quite remarkable going on there. If you recall, for those of you who know Steiner's work, he mentions 2 Christ children, one of them being Zoroaster, being influenced by the entity of Zoroaster. So I think what we have here is some plug-in to a mystery tradition in that area. Now, just to make things well-rounded in all this, in the middle of talking about all this, Gurdjieff talks about this person who led him to the Sarmon Brotherhood, talking about the World Brotherhood. So these are all interconnected pieces that are associated with this World Brotherhood. Now, is the World Brotherhood the Great White Brotherhood that Cayce's work brought forward and is referenced in theosophical material? The Great White Brotherhood is supposedly the brotherhood that Jesus and Saint Germain and all these others are part of to move humanity forward. The Great White Brotherhood may be the World Brotherhood, but we're dealing with a group that is attempting to influence humanity in a spiritually evolutionary track. And these are the encounters with the people who worked directly to try to be their arms and legs, people like Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and Bennett, and certainly through the work of Steiner, etc. This is the legacy, and so much of it is what they've prepared for us to use in this period that we're moving into, which they realized was going to be a great strain for humanity, as World War II was, but this is something else again. And with that, Miss Olivia, I hand it off to you.
Okay. So I'm going to start with an easy one.
Yes.
Brian Davis just finished reading Meetings with Remarkable Men. Does DJ know whatever happened to Gurdjieff's secret map of Egypt?
Yeah, that is very interesting. He talks about pre-Sands Egypt. And what does that sound like? It sounds like Casey's version of the 10,000 BC Rata Egypt, which built the pyramids and the Sphinx, and which the Atlanteans migrated to. If you connect the dots between Casey's work, Gurdjieff's work, and then you go to somebody, a researcher like the late John Anthony West or Graham Hancock, you're going to connect all those dots through archaeoastronomy and all the rest. And we're going to realize that the Egyptian culture was founded in 10,500 BC, not 4,000 BC, pre-dynastic. So you've got about 6,000 years of missing history there. But in terms of what he did with the artifact, it's a real good question. Yes.
David Tormina. DJ, isn't it very telling that the origin of most of the great mysteries are located in places where highly restrictive societies seem to always exist?
That's really true. Well, Gurdjieff had said that you had two different types of pieces on this. One of the pieces was what to do, and the other one was how to do it. And the what to do was throughout the religions, turn the other cheek and all the rest of those, love your neighbor. But the how to do it, which were the techniques and the methods, when they were the people who practicing them were out in society, they would always be leading the people on an upward trajectory, which people like the Pharisees and all the rest would never want. It's why they participate in having the Romans crucify Jesus. So what we're looking at is that part gets persecuted, the how to do it. And that's what we're talking about. That's the piece that goes underground. I'll give you a very strange interpretation of the events of Afghanistan in the past few days. Are we looking at a large-scale signal when this plane takes off and all these people are chasing it and all the rest? Is this some kind of a snapshot that they know that the mystery schools have left Afghanistan? Is that the message that's being communicated there? Forget about the Taliban and forget about the drama as it's presented. What does it actually look like? It looks like a large-scale exodus from Afghanistan. Well, it didn't have to be all that dramatic. We knew this was coming for 20 years.
You're thinking like Joseph Farrell.
That is very much like a Farrell. But there's something in that which just does not look right. And there's no way that these people would be caught with egg on their face unless they're just complete idiots. Militarily, how many times have they gamed out leaving Afghanistan? And whatever you want to say about Trump or whatever, would he have ever left like that with $1 trillion worth of, really Blackhawks and all the rest of it? I mean, it's ridiculous. It's an incredible giveaway and bizarre beyond belief. Of course, that's the heroin capital of the world. So what is it that's going on there? The Taliban have not been really popular on the heroin creating side. As a matter of fact, when they were in power, heroin development went down to almost nothing. We got them out, and the heroin capital of the world became Afghanistan again. So, in essence, they're forming alliances with China. Does that mean China now has the heroin market? That's what it looks like. Yes.
Frank Monday wanted me to ask you about that jumbo jet and the people supposedly hanging off a jumbo jet, not getting sucked into the engines, and that it seemed extremely staged.
Well, it's too sad to call it anything. That's the problem with it. But I think the situation there in reality is dire for those people because they had 20 years thinking they were moving into a different culture. And then we just, drop the bags and run. It's very strange. They could have done all that in 2014 and it would have been done in a very different fashion. This one is very strange. I found an interesting little tidbit is that the Taliban threw all the vaccines out in the
Mhm.
various things. Well, you have to say this about the Taliban, like they know who their enemy is and they're like, oh, these guys left us nice vaccines. I don't think so. So they have no illusions about the attempts to depopulate them because, hey, listen, when we're not supporting them, we've done a damn good job in that part of the world of trying to get rid of those people. So, there's something very sneaky about the collapse in 3 days of the world's greatest military. It's definitely not as presented. That much is for sure, Frank Monday. Yes.
And on that note,
Uh-huh.
let me find it. Carl Young said, my guess, America is pulling China into Afghanistan to give them their Waterloo.
Well, that's interesting. We lured the Soviet Union in there, supposedly. But I'll tell you, if we've run a place for 20 years, then we only get out because our interests, somebody is taking over our interests there. And, so then with their mouths open, like, oh, we can't believe these Taliban, they treat women so terribly, which they do. But they don't care. Look at, where's Kamala Harris? She didn't say anything about it. Nothing. It's completely useless vice president. If there was an opportunity there to, prove your critics wrong. And she didn't say anything. Jen Psaki went on vacation. Geez, too bad about women's rights, but vacation, water skiing was waiting there, Jen.
Oh.
By the way, Jen worked for 12 years for the Pentagon. Remember Benghazi and all that? Yeah. Take a good look at Jen's background. What else you got?
I didn't know about this. Fred D says, how does Daniel feel about being a twig on the branch that leads to David Icke on the Deep State Mapping Project? Did you know about this?
No, that's pretty good though. Well, Icke is he's deep.
He's a legend.
He's gonna be in the thick of things. There's no getting around it. But it's pretty funny that I'm the connecting link. I got to figure that one
Well,
out.
I guess you're a twig, right?
Right. What else you got?
David Tremaine again. DJ, I read some blogs that were very negative on Gurdjieff. They tried to link him directly to Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin as instructing them directly. Did the Nazis use his methods for world domination?
No, it's interesting. There's a lot of misinterpretation because of the nature of what was going on in that period, World War I and World War II, and the kinds of connections you could have. The Stalin thing comes up because Gurdjieff and Stalin apparently went to the same sort of military boarding school. That's about the only connection. They've said later, oh, the reason he spied for Russia was because he knew Stalin. When Rasputin was around and the royal family was using him, it became like, if you were good at psychic stuff, that everyone wanted their own Rasputin. So there were a lot of opportunities there. And, this is part of the stuff that Gurdjieff could have easily been involved in. We know that he was doing this type of psychic surveillance type stuff for this Turkish prince, which is why Bennett was investigating him in the first place. He was sent in there by British intelligence saying, what is this guy doing for this prince? But it turned out that Gurdjieff had been friends with this prince for years. So he had those connections. The system of ideas he taught has a very firm kind of integrity around the ideas. When I think about Gurdjieff, I think that he had an integrity to the work, but I think he was a flawed individual, as a teacher. So, he was a complete maverick in that sense, which is, how are you going to get an individual like that who can go across mountain chains and suffer and get shot? By the way, he was shot, he had 3 near-death experiences, which led him to a lot of those realizations psychically and to understand the separation of his astral body. I sometimes have told this story about when he meets Bennett and he says, okay, what do you want from me? And Bennett says, I want to know, I want to astral travel, basically. I'm not going to mince words. And Gurdjieff said, oh, that's easy. I'll teach it to you. sit in this room, do this exercise, sensing exercise, sensing exercise, which has to do with altering your vision by moving something in front of it. He does a sensing exercise and nothing happens. So he comes out a half hour later to Gurdjieff. He says, nothing happened. And Gurdjieff said, oh, you're not doing it right. You just take your time with it. Spend some time with it. So Bennett's in there. He's doing it. And lo and behold, he astral travels right out of his body. And he looks down at himself sitting in the chair there very quietly. And he's astonished by the whole thing. And then the door opens. Gurdjieff looks at the Bennett in the chair and then looks up at the Bennett astral body and sort of smirks. It's like, I guess you did it. And he closes the door. That's his early engagement. So these are the types of things that Gurdjieff had learned, and he taught that to him in an afternoon, right?
Okay, so I have a question around this.
Yes.
What is the purpose of learning to astrally separate from your body?
Actually, in the Gurdjieff work, they hide away and they actually suggest that you not use psychic tools in a random, curious manner. But there is an application for them. In Theosophy, they put a lot of the psychic stuff right up front. And so that's the difference, I think, between those two systems in a lot of ways. The Gurdjieff thing is all about, what are you going to do, and what is your aim? And the Theosophical thing is kind of like, did you know you have an ethereal body and you have an astral body and you can do these things and you can associate with beings that aren't visible and you can do, it's really showing you the range that you have as a spiritual being having a physical experience. The Gurdjieff thing does that, but it goes totally different. It says, what is it that you need to fix about yourself? And how does you fixing it about yourself help those around you? And then how do you help the larger spiritual understanding in general by the things that you've learned? So it goes into these levels, and that's what I think makes it exciting. And looking back on it, Search for the Miraculous came out in 1949. Okay, so what are we talking about? 70 years ago. The kind of electricity around that book, those experiences and the ideas resonate so much now because, it's like Burma or some of these other characters in the early Rosicrucians, the essence of what they do has an electricity to it, and then it jumps into you and you start to get the flow of that. And like, I have so many more abilities that I wasn't aware of. Yes.
These are all really deep questions. Okay, so no one wants to know, has anyone done a critical analysis / comparison between the works of Steiner, Ouspensky, and Gurdjieff and teased out the critical differences? Gypsy Moon wants to know, can DJ give us a synopsis of the difference in the teachings between Gurdjieff and Ouspensky?
I was going to say, yes.
Okay.
This is kind of what we've done on this program. It is. Like, if you look at the episodes that deal with Steiner and deal with Gurdjieff and deal with Casey, you will get those different separations. So I would say if you're looking for someone who has sussed out the differences on the mystery school side, you look no further. That's what the X series has done. But there are fantastic works around it, so even, books like Psychic Self-Defense. There have been real breakthroughs all around this, whether you're coming in on anthroposophy or coming in through the Casey work. If you look at Casey's work on Casey and Atlantis, it's such a fundamental breakthrough. There's no repository of information anywhere that has as much information about Atlantis as that little book of Casey's readings. And Casey did something like 1,000 readings dealing just with Atlantis based on the past life memory of the individual who was coming to him. So I think that you're right, though, in this sense, which is what's going on here. These are really the levels and layers of the foundation of the mystery schools becoming public and giving us their ideas and their knowledge. You have to go through that, the work of Blavatsky, the work of Besant, the work of Steiner, the work of Casey, the work of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. It's a moving train in that direction. It is the mystery schools deciding we need to let this out publicly because spiritually the culture is in jeopardy. And before, remember, what they were particularly good at was keeping it secret. But the secrecy wasn't serving the culture anymore because this other thing was taking over. So there was a great danger. And so this period is, what they were aiming at. But the battle starts in this era in 1840. So I hope that answers your question. Yes.
Okay, so on that note, Joseph Correa wanted to know, did Gurdjieff or Ouspensky make any distinction between ensouled and NPC people?
NPC, like that whole thing?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Steiner talked about black holes. And there is that aspect in humanity. There's no question about it. But I think everyone has that spiritual part. In some people, it's covered over and it's latent. It's not manifested. So sometimes you can have somebody who's living a very superficial life and an incident happens to them. Like you're very interested in NDEs, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I have seen in NDE type research, a lot of those people, before they have the NDE, the spirituality was bottled up in them. And so it doesn't always take that. For example, it can just take a transformative incident or something on the world stage, even like the things that we're seeing now, may cause this latent spirituality to be jarred and opened up. But it's there. It's like a pattern that needs to be awakened. Remember Sleeping Beauty? This is something to be awakened that's going on there. And in sleep, we have it, but it's latent. It's not manifested. It's not active. What is it that we see in the fourth way with Gurdjieff? He's talking about people are acting mechanically because they're coming more and more under the influence of these laws of the earth. And so as a mechanical actor, they're not using their full capacity. And so what does it end up looking like? What does it become? It becomes like sleep. And what happens in sleep? Your involuntary manifestation of anything can happen because when you're asleep, you're not in control. So anything can happen. So the point is to wake up. And very often, you hear wake up used in political terms and people are yelling their heads off like, you wake up and go change the world because look, they're taking your country away. It's like waking up doesn't have to be a big upset. It can be you can actually wake up very calmly. And, so that's kind of a misuse sometimes as it happens. But waking up is essential because if we fall into the transhumanist trap, being drowsy on a spiritual level, the message from the Steiner work and from Gurdjieff and Ouspensky is you're going to fall into that mechanicalness. They call it the mechanical laws, humanity sleeping machines. Steiner calls it the eighth sphere, people disappearing into Ahriman's trap. I don't know what Casey would call it, but this is what they're referring to. So we know that we're deep in it. Yes.
Michael Winstonley wants to know, what about the collective egregore? Does that come up in any of his work?
No question. What that reminds me of is when Ouspensky talks about nations, and that when a nation moves, it's like a dragon, and we see it, and it's monstrous. And he says that, individuals have such a higher mind compared to the actual nation. and that the nation operates on a very primitive, primordial level. So that's what that makes me think of, that there's these movements of things which are large, and just like there's this whole thing about Steiner speaking in relation to comets when they strike the earth, and how they have this spiritual significance, or they can be a warning, or they can be instructive, or they can provide an impulse for spiritual journeys. These are things that native cultures, the Native Americans, understood very well. In fact, one of the things I learned from Grant Hancock was that many of the sacred sites are on these magnetic tracks that were caused by great impacts of comets, and that they realize when these things hit from space that there is something sacred associated with it. And that's why you'll see a serpent mound in Ohio on this highly magnetic site of, something where a major comet hit took place. So there is that combination. Yes.
I'm going to jump to this question. Roosevelt Media News says, if they are afraid of spirituality, meaning the New World Order, does this mean that spirituality can defeat them?
Yeah. What you're making me think of is I've been reading a lot of and revisiting a lot of Ouspensky. One of the things that he was talking about was when you become aware, when you become self-aware, conditions change, which means opportunities change. So we think we're heading right into this transhumanist battle. And as we see it, a number of people look at it and say we are, because they're going to demand things that are inhuman of us, and we're not going to go for it. So what's going to happen there? A number of things could happen, but that looks like a clash coming down the pike. And we've seen it already. There are already people throwing off the chains of biomedical servitude. But knowing that as we become more aware, conditions change, and then the opportunities change because our awareness has changed. Therefore, if we look at it just as this, like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they might have looked at it as, there's not going to be any way to stop these guys from putting missiles in. We're going to have to exchange nuclear weapons with them. That was the straight ahead, here comes the clash line. Somehow, President Kennedy, working through back channels, was able to create a different reality for us. We have the ability to create a different reality here. Just like at a certain point in 1942, everywhere that people looked, Hitler was triumphant, moving in and advancing on these defenseless countries. And there's a Casey reading where they say, what's going to happen? What is Hitler's destiny, to rule Europe? And Casey said one word about his destiny. He said, his destiny is death. So that's where they're heading. How it plays out is anybody's guess, but certainly the more aware we are, the more instantly the conditions of the situation change based on our awareness. So looking at that, we can see the reality changes based on our awareness as well. So it is fundamentally a personal experience and a world collective experience. But on the personal side, there's a great motivation for us to become more aware along this line. Yes.
Kaiser Night Eyes wants to know, what does DJ suggest we do to, quote, do more?
Well, you're in the ideas room. That's a good start. You're working with ideas like I'm working with ideas. And I think that there are people who've given us very practical directions on day-to-day things. The work of Catherine Austin Fitz. I think when it comes to spiritual methods and understanding psychic experience, the work of G.G. Jung is something, these are things that are available to us now. You can look back, there are periods when there aren't incredible things and incredible people like what we see now. So they are there. And certainly I've tried to have them associated with the work that we do here as much as possible. And I will more. But my real suggestion is to take that essence of the mystery school work and to see, if it applies in your own life and if you can work with it. I don't think that, like someone had said to me, well, is there something that I can learn in a book that was, say, written almost a century ago or whatever? And the question is, you seek out the knowledge and you apply it in your own era, and then it becomes almost something else. It sort of springs to life in 2021 as something different and unique. So wherever your eye of study goes, you have a kind of intuitive compass. A magnetic center is forming there. And the more that you explore the ideas, the more those things will open to you. And try to avoid as many of the pitfalls or waste of time as possible, because there's a lot of them, especially with the incredible marketing engine that we've seen. And, I've mentioned things like Gaia TV. They're not the only one, but like that kind of fast food stuff on this tip, it's fine. Some people probably would enjoy it, right? Just like Ancient Aliens. But it has no depth, it's like half-inch deep. So if you want to understand these things, I suggest you go deeper with it. And that's what we try to do with this work. So, but it's a great question.
Can I
Yes.
answer that? I'd like to answer the question.
You've got some good answers. Go ahead.
What, just figure out what you would do. And it's hard to do this if you were not afraid, and do that. And that, because what everyone is saying the same thing, that they can't believe what's happened to the world. They just can't believe it, right? And it is like the frog in the pot, right? And it's so incremental. We're getting used to, diminishing circumstances until, but we know, and they're saying it in the ideas room, we know that this road, we know where it leads, right? There's no reason we should comply anymore, because we're helping them.
Yeah.
So, but this is ultimate. This is the spiritual path.
Yes.
Is in some ways parallel to sort of a political path. It's about freedom, right? All of this is about freedom, spiritual freedom, liberation from laws, rules. This is, self-rule, sovereignty. So now's the time, we have to overcome our fear.
No, I agree.
And that ultimately means we have to identify with our soul, which is immortal, and sort of understand that life is suffering, and that we're going to suffer no matter what. This isn't going to be comfortable. This is going to be painful, but maybe we can choose the pain.
Yes.
Ourselves.
It's a great opportunity to demonstrate that faith and bravery. There's no question about it. Wow. Well, that gets very, very deep, actually. And I appreciate that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep on episode X series 106. This is the Gurdjieff Mystery School warning. A world in crisis. The fourth way. P.D. Ouspensky, J.G. Bennett. What were they trying to tell us? What was the Sarmon Brotherhood? What was being let out into the culture? Have we used it? Have we used all the things that they gave us? Have we used the tools? Has the greater portion of humanity had access to the tools? Well, those books and those groups have been out there for a long time. What's going on now? Where are we now? That's what we're discovering here together in the Ideas Room with these questions. We're going to be taking a few more questions here. And before we do, I had a quote related to this. And again, this is kind of interesting. This is Bennett in a very simple way talking about how you can convey to somebody work on oneself. How do you work on oneself? Here's his example, and he did it for years. During the original lecture, Mr. Bennett conducted the following experiment. I have been thinking how I can try to convey to you what is meant by work on oneself. It occurred to me to suggest that you should make a simple experiment with me, which might help you to make clear one or two things that I want to explain to you this evening. I want each of you to hold your arms straight above your head. All right, you can actually try this. One arm straight above your head. Two arms straight above your head. It's a simple experiment. Mr. Bennett then held his own arms straight above his head, and everyone in the hall, there were about 350 people, did the same. After a few seconds, he said, now stretch your arms as far as you can, up, straight up. And the arms then went up by anything up to 4 inches. Mr. Bennett then asked those present to count 1, 2, 3, 4. 4, 3, 2, 1. 2, 3, 4, 5. 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. When they had reached 12, he asked them to stretch their arms again. It was at once obvious that nearly everyone had allowed the arms to drop. Mr. Bennett then continued, what did you notice? That when your attention has been taken away by your arms by putting it to the counting, you relax the effort to straighten them, and when I said straighten your arms again, almost all the arms, without exception, went up an inch or two. I want to use this to illustrate what I mean by work on oneself. In the first place, to put your arms above your head was perhaps to some people an effort because they thought this was a ridiculous thing to do in a lecture hall. But nearly everyone made this effort, whether they thought it was ridiculous or not. Then came an illustration of the relation of our will to our own body. You put your arms above your heads, but with very few exceptions, and those mostly people who had done it before, you did not make a special effort to straighten them. It was only when I drew your attention to it and said stretch your arms that you realized there was an additional effort to be made. So long as you were making this additional effort, most people's arms continued to be straight, but only until we began to count. Then the effort was diverted from the stretching of your arms to the counting, and the unusual way of counting engaged your attention so that you no longer made the effort of stretching your arms. At the end, when I said stretch your arms, almost all arms straightened and went up an inch or two. Two factors are involved in this. One is the ability and decision to make a certain effort, and the second is the work of attention. Even if I decide to make a certain effort, I can only continue so long as a sufficient quality and quantity of attention is available. I have to be able to bring my attention to something. It has to be the first core principle in work on oneself. So if somebody's always flashing to an iPhone and all the rest of it, well, our attention goes all over the place. And that's fun and entertaining. It's good sometimes too. But that focus, sharp focus that's necessary for work on oneself operates very much like what Bennett is telling us there. And then he says, you will notice that I speak about attention as though it were something material. And so it is. Attention is matter. It's a particular kind of energy or material of which at any given moment we have a certain quantity of in our organism. When that certain quantity is used up, if we use it faster than we produce it, we cannot, whatever decision we may take, whatever necessity they may be, continue to control our attention. This is generally true of everything we do. All inner and outer processes in the life of man or woman depend upon matter or energy. If we have the necessary material or energy for a process, that process is possible. So, in a lot of the mystery school work, there are exercises. When people do traditional meditation, when they do yoga and things like that, it produces a concentration, a level of energy. Work, as we saw in the Gurdjieff, at the Priory, he would put these intellectuals to work, and they would do the most basic things. They could do woodwork, they could clean the floor, they could prepare meals, whatever it was, but it gave them a quality of attention so that their mind wasn't running away with them. Um, it seems like there's some tremendous key in that work function. And this also, it gets into the different centers that Gurdjieff talked about. And one of those centers that he referred to is called the moving center. And some people, it was very obvious, have very good moving centers. Have you ever been in a cafe and you've seen the barista and they're just fantastic, right? They know how to do everything. And then someone else comes up to do the same job and they're like, where is this thing? Where is that thing? And they're moving slow and they're crisscrossing their attention. They're totally lost. Well, one has the attention in a moving center to be able to do this, and the other one isn't really, up to the job. So in a Gurdjieff school, in a fourth way training school, what they would do is they would work with the person's moving center by having them do basic Gurdjieff movements, counting exercises, and things like that. And it would change the way that their mental state is. The other thing, and we've, other people who've come through these different things like Feldenkrais, which is all the posture things, the way that you align your body, your actual thoughts change based on your posture when you go into something. So these things all work on us. So there's a range of work for someone to just start off with right off the bat that can make a tremendous difference in any case. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is X Series 106. It's deep on the Gurdjieff Mystery School warning, the secret, as it were, that there's a world in crisis coming. And what were the techniques? What were the things, the themes, the ideas, and the tools that they were trying to give us for this period? That's what we've been exploring tonight, and it runs deep, I can tell you. And Miss Olivia, you run right deep with it. Go ahead.
Najat Madri,
Yes.
What you were just saying, this explains why the Great Reset is anti-work. Stay home, get a universal income.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Well, and as we know, the Gurdjieff work, they have their side of that, and the Gurdjieff movements and the Gurdjieff dance. But in anthroposophy, they have eurythmy and they have that art of movement. It's the whole thing. It's there in both. As a matter of fact, there's someone named Del Croze who in the 1920s, both Gurdjieff and as choreographer, both Gurdjieff and Steiner were using for that choreography, and maybe that's where Steiner made disparaging remarks about Gurdjieff, even though I've never heard it. All right. Yes.
I got 5% left on my computer.
Okay.
So we've got to wrap it up.
So far, so good.
So a cult fan, beast buzz and in vibrations and wavelengths have everything to do with moving through time and dimensions relative to TARDIS. So does DJ have any thoughts on this angle? Bees buzzing and vibrations.
Well, since you mentioned, there's kind of a time travel thing there that I'm getting with what you're saying. Here's an interesting thing. Bennett talked about how Gurdjieff had taken him aside and said, you are going to reveal the true purpose of Judas in the Gospels. That's one of the missions I'm going to give you. And Bennett was like, look, this is kind of very straight ahead. We know that he betrayed Jesus and all the rest. And Gurdjieff said there's a much deeper story to that. And he said, what text am I going to study? And Gurdjieff put his arm around him. And as he put his arm around him, he found himself going backwards in time as Gurdjieff was talking about this. And he found himself looking around and seeing, Judea. And he was back in a different time and all the rest of it, and then bringing him right back into the present. Those are the types of things, that there is a timeline that is travel, that you can travel on. And I think that on the esoteric side of things, bees really show up as part of that. It's like they're operating in a different timeline. I would also say, in relation to this feeling about traveling through things, I've had that at times with people who have a mystical nature, but when I've worked with Gigi, actually, Gigi Young, when we were looking at research or doing something, I could feel myself going as she was going psychically to it. I could feel the time factor disappearing. And when she was done doing this research on it, you know, the time that had passed was so different from how the time felt that I could see, you know, I could flash that moment of Bennett with Gurdjieff and say, you know, when somebody gets on a certain level, the time ceases to be what it is, and your ability to access things and go to places also changes dramatically. And I think that that is part of the incredible things that we're here to discover. Yes.
Frank Monday said that Necronomicon means the buzzing of insects. Lovecraft pierced the veil and went through the gates of the Silver Key.
Oh, wow. Well, you've got something very important there, and you may find that there's going to be a follow-up to your comments, sir, because there's something very interesting about Lovecraft we're going to bring out. Everyone, it's been great to be here with you tonight. We're going to do more on the mystery schools, bringing this forward. We're also going to be coming back with the Female Targets show as well, part 3 of that. Yes.
One more bee comment.
Okay.
The bee stuff is great. Al Kaider, the cavities under bumblebee's wing are vibrated to create a wave at the same frequency as the Schumann resonance, which enables them to fly in a bubble.
Wow. Oh, it's incredible. Well, we understand the ancient Egyptians had this relationship to them. They also understood that honey is something that preserves. And, you know, when I think about this, there's a series of Ledbetter texts about things that came here from other planets. And I want to say that there's so many fascinating things in Ledbetter's work, but there's a piece about how bees are not native to Earth that I found very interesting because they've always stood out. And it seemed like with the whole GMO push and with the whole Monsanto thing that RFK Jr. helped to expose, that what was happening really, if you think about it, was this incredible, you know, the takeover of these kind of the kingdom of nature. And the bees really held the key on so much of that. So going through these periods of bee collapse and all the rest of it had to be a bad sign esoterically as well as physically in the world. And so a lot of that are the things that came to mind when you mentioned that. Everyone, it's been great to have you here. Miss Olivia, you got anything else?
I'm tempted to. David Trevino says, bees and handbags, handbags and bees. It's honey, bitches. Deal with it.
Wow. I saw that Tormina picked up on Frank Lloyd Wright there. There's a big piece there. You know, what's interesting with Frank Lloyd Wright and Gurdjieff and Bennett, Lloyd Wright's son, of course, is the architect of that very strange Mayan temple that Hodel and his weird evil cult took over. So there's all kinds of interesting crisscrosses going on in this work, which sometimes, you know, blow my mind because I wasn't anticipating it. I remember I was doing the Vicki Morgan story, and I had been doing all this work on a potential episode, The Mamas and the Papas in the Hot Zone, which I used for a lot of the Hodel episode. And what happened was, in the middle of it, Michelle Phillips showed up. And she was, you know, associated with this billionaire from the Netherlands who was dating Vicki Morgan, and she was his best friend, along with Warren Beatty. And he came to Hollywood and became like Mr. Hollywood. I was just like, you know, it's incredible the things you can't plan for this stuff. It leads you to places. Doors open. Those connections will be known, and that's the remarkable thing about it. Should we do some shout-outs?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So Super Chatters. Josh Randall, I have to say, tonight just went above and beyond. Thank you so much, Josh. Eurythmy is fun. Catherine Amelia, Occult Fan, Debbie McAdoo, Jonathan Kiner, Bill Gometz, Nacrius 3.7, Gil and Joy R, Dorian Hewitt, Stacy Marie, Roosevelt Media News, The Mailer Demon, Enigma, Brian Berner, David DeBurr, and B. Brax. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, we really appreciate your support, and it's great to see so many of you in the ideas room tonight. We appreciate all our subscribers as well who keep the show going, and thank you for supporting us tonight. I have to do a couple of shout outs, just too many great people up there. Eurythmy is fun. It's great to see you. Esoteric Gold, a cult fan, the man, the myth, Debbie McAdoo, Luke Walker, Mordecai, Scarlet Fire, Modwiz, the man, he's there. Rome Grown, I like that. I don't know that one. Najat, it's great to see you out there. Debbie McAdoo, Witch 76, that's pretty good. Jack, it's great to see you, sir. Shane Walker, unbelievable crowd. Great questions in the ideas room tonight, just off the charts. Frank Monday, of course, knocking it out of the park. We will be back next week on Friday, 8 p.m. We're going deep with X Series 107. And we also have some surprises for you on the interview front. Remember to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That's basically a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch in case the social media collapses. And then where will we be then? Fourth Way School. So make sure you do that. Also get behind the show, subscribe to us. So many people are helping us doing this work. Go forward. Esoteric Fairy Tales. Great to see you. We will see you all next Friday, and have a great weekend. I will be keeping an eye on everything for you, and enjoy your summer as well. You know, the end of August only comes around once a year.
That's
after
true.
all.
And it's precious.
And Miss Olivia, final word is for you. Great.
I don't know. I'm just finding it's really necessary to find peace within. And like I used to, when I was younger, peace, what's that? You know, it wasn't glamorous or sexy enough, you know. But if Gurdjieff has taught me anything, it's about and I've still got a lot to learn. It's about being in control of my emotions, being centered, being peaceful, not allowing my energy not losing my energy over minor things, you know, and that your energy is precious and you can't transform without that energy, right? So you have to, it's sacred.
That's a really good point, actually. He compared a really deep emotional upset with an explosion in the factory of your machine that takes like 3 days to get the factory back in shape. The right use of those emotions. Wow, that's a really big piece. It's interesting too, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I think of it, deep in that teaching is the fact that it takes emotions, though, to transform. That's the thing. It doesn't say get rid of your emotions. It actually says use your emotions and don't just become the puppet of their involuntary manifestation. That's something I think all of us can work on. So absolutely fascinating. You did a great job. Bravo,
Thank you.
Everyone. Miss Olivia. We will be back with you next week. Everyone stay safe out there. And, you know, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. See you soon.